Let me start by thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation. Actually, I didn't know I would be able to do the presentation because I just came back from London this morning. The flight was delayed and we got to Abuja around 7 a.m. So I'm still in Abuja, hoping to go to Lokoja. So thank you for the opportunity. I don't have a paper in the real sense of it, but I have my thought written down. So I'm going to title my presentation. It just came now. I will title it as Bridging the Gap Between the Old and the New, History Curriculum in Nigeria. Again, I said the title is Bridging the Gap Between the Old and the New, History Curriculum in Nigeria. I also want to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to go to Professor Toyin Falola's paper, The Teaching of History and Curriculum Reform in Nigeria. When I went through the paper, it actually summarized everything I'm about to say. I finished with my jotting and I had the opportunity of going to Professor Falola's paper. That's actually summarized what I want to share with this panel. I'm interested in some issues raised by Professor Toyin Falola, which will form the basis of my discussion. Professor Falola posits that curriculum must be transformed to review the specific concept and national issue for the understanding of students and be made as concrete as possible. The most interesting part of the Professor Falola's presentation to me is the question he raised, and he answered it himself. He said, one, as the government reintroduced history into the Nigerian curriculum, Professor Falola's answered is yes. Then the second question is, but can we say that history teaching has taken the right shape since this reinstatement? He answered no. I said on this note, I want to base my discussion titled Bridging the Gap Between the Old and the New, Re-strategizing history curriculum in Nigeria. Re-strategizing history curriculum in Nigeria. What do I mean by bridging the gap between the old and new? I said our generation, people like Alao and co up to the older generation, we went through the old curriculum. And I want to say, without fear of favor, that some of us that are historians today, it is this old curriculum that has made us. When we mention names like Toyin Falola, Obaro Kime, Baba Shuaju, and others, many fantastic, remarkable historians in Nigeria, we went through this old curriculum and we are what we are today. The old curriculum, they were these first generation remarkable historians, they were well grounded in what I refer to as old curriculum. There is something special about the curriculum that we must adopt in our bid to formulate new curriculum or we strategize for new one. I said some of the content in my thought, I said some of the content of the old curriculum are still relevant. So the new curriculum, whatever we are strategizing, must contain some of these issues, like some prehistoric issues, some pre-colonial topics, because knowing our past is very germane to our existence. So if we start a new curriculum for our students and things like that, and they don't know anything about their past, it will look as if we are not doing anything. So, and I said that some of the subjects that are necessary, some of these issues, whether some prehistoric issues, some pre-colonial issues, they are very important to correct some Eurocentric impressions. Like we all know, some of this Eurocentric idea that Mungo Park discovered River Niger. And when you ask some of our children today, some of them that are not, don't have the knowledge of history, they will continue to tell you Mungo Park, Discover River Niger. But some of these issues that in the old curriculum, we must also adapt it. Our children must know about our forebear civilization to counter some of this Eurocentric idea. And I said the Historical Society of Nigeria has a major role to play in this respect. The issue has been raised about lack of interest in history, how the curriculum is boring and how students run away from history. Then I also said that there are some issues we must identify for discussion. Though some of these issues, by the time we start discussing, it will take us time. In fact, it's another conference topic on its own. But let me also say that some of the problems I've identified is that we lack history teachers. We lack at both primary, secondary, and even in the university. Why do I say this? With the exception of University of Ibadan that I know, all other departments of history, they have changed their nomenclature. History and this, history and international studies, history and I remember when I was the president of the Historical Society, or even as when I go on accreditation, I will not mention some of these universities. You find somebody teaching historical method who is not a historian. It's just because they said history and international studies, history and diplomatic studies, and you bring somebody. I will not mention the universities in the East. And I asked myself, what type of history is this one going to teach? The only something that he has is, I learned he has a PhD in archival studies from Rome. And so what do you expect from a product of this non-historian? I want to say that his products are all likely to graduate without any knowledge of history, even historical methodology. And these people will also go back to secondary school. They are always lucky to be employed before any historian, and they will be teaching history. So the interest is not there. Even some of our students also, the interest is not there. The university level. So I'm greeting Professor Falola. I can see him on the board. So you can also see that some of our students, especially those of us who happen to be in admission committee, you hardly see people applying to read history. And by the time they fail to get admission, they will be appealing that they want to read any course. And some of us, because of you can also us because we are historian, especially those of happen to be in admission committee. Yes, we always give them admission. And most of them, it is when they get to 400 level, they will start interest in history. So some of these products, when they graduate from university, they go to, they are employed in secondary school. Without this interest, they start teaching our children history. And you don't expect them to be enthusiastic about it. They don't, the interest is not there. And these are things that are causing some of the students to be afraid of taking history. And like I said, that's my personal opinion. I am totally against the change of nomenclature. Even if you say history and international studies, even our syllabus, you teach international studies. You teach diplomatic studies. But this idea of changing the name, and that is why some university administrators, they force many history departments to employ their own people who are not historians. And the evil, that one is, the evil we do ourselves in this respect has actually affected us. As well as secondary school level, if we take the statistics of those teaching history. I will give you an example. I organized a program in Lokoja for secondary school history teachers. By the time I asked, how many of you really did history in your university? It's only 5% of them. All other people are government, social studies, and they are teaching history. You cannot expect them to be committed. So we find in many institutions, many secondary school, people from government, social studies and other teaching. I give you another example. I was in Defense College on sabbatical. When I go to Defense College, the person teaching military history is somebody from political science. And as the president of Historical Society, I had to write a protest letter to the commander that no, this one cannot teach history. So we have all these people, all these funny, sorry to say, characters teaching history that should be taught by those who are trained in them. And I said a greater responsibility lies on the shoulders of teachers to make the lesson more interactive and more interesting. And then we need new curriculum. Like I said, it is the title of my something is Bridging the Gap Between the Old and the New. The old syllabus that have produced people like Tony Falola and co. Yeah, and the news and our news, our children that are coming up now, we also have to consider that within the modern context. We are in the era of technology. And I say that history cannot be left behind in this era of technology. I went to Professor Falola's paper, made the paper today, and I saw how he emphasized much on the technology, digital history, I think like something like that. I also have it here, I said, the new curriculum that we're about to develop need to enable history students to compete with their other colleagues after graduation. They need to compete with their other colleague. And I also, as one advice that Professor Falola gave, that is combined ons. I think we don't even have it again. In my days in the university, you have somebody reading history and political science, people reading history and other disciplines, but we don't have it now. And I think that it's another issue that we in history, we take up, those of us who have opportunity to have connection with those people that matters. I said, while developing history curriculum now, there's a need. I said that history is not all about politics. History goes beyond politics. History is not the rise and fall of empire alone. And I said some topical issues like entrepreneurship. We must be able to add it into the new syllabus. Digital history must be introduced. And I said, after all, there is no human activity or profession without history. History is all encompassing. And so we should take that into consideration. And I said in developing new curriculum, contemporary issues must also be considered. Like the issue of national development, we are talking about integration in the society now, and all this, I think we should take it into consideration. For me, I want to conclude that there is a need to bridge the old and the new. There should be a bridge between the old and the new syllabus. We cannot discard one for the other. And I said for my own takeaway from this, my presentation, one, we must call upon our historians. There is a need to publish books that will attract the attention of the younger ones in secondary school, primary school, books that will attract their attention. And I said again, people say we are in knowledge economy, but I say that more than that, we are in platform economy now. Platform, those who have the opportunity of creating platform, the way they make money. I said we can also engage ourselves to have what we call historical platform. Historical platform where we can make it possible that history will be interesting and people will be happy to be associated with the study with their own history. And I said again, there's a need for us to continue to train teachers in whether primary school or secondary school. Me, whether because of my position, I think I have the wherewithal. I started it in a local job, for example. During the long vacation, I invite primary school and secondary school teacher to the university, and to make them to make history, so that we can continue to develop there, so that when they resume, they'll be able to take up their students. And I said we need to adopt technology to teach history. And finally, we say history cannot be taught alone by that the teacher will just come and start talking. There is a need for us to some of this dramatize some of the things we are teaching, especially at the primary or secondary school level, dramatize them, the need for excursion and the use of documentaries. So these are the thoughts that I was able to put down in the plane when I was coming this morning. And I hope I have not disappointed you people. I thank you for the opportunity you have given me to do this presentation. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Prof. If you can hear me, many thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. You can hear us now?
Sorry?
You can hear us now? Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you.
You heard everything, and thank you. I know you're busy, so thank you for writing this on the plane. Much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
May I call now Professor Gwadabe, please? Professor Gwadabe from ABU in Zaria. Zaria is a very important place for for historical studies and for actually Nigerian universities. It's the second university in the country, am I right? Second one or third one after Nsukka when it was built, I mean, in time. But oh yes, but also it's an important one for IFRA, because IFRA used to be based in Ibadan and Zaria, and that's a place where I've been to do my PhD years ago. So, Prof, the floor is yours. There you
go. I also want to begin by thanking the organizers of this meeting for calling us to discuss about curriculum, the need for curriculum update. To be frank, it's sometimes interesting to speak last as the last person. But in another way, you find that most of what you want to discuss, that the whole background has been given by others. What I want to begin by saying is that I realize there's a consensus on the subject we're discussing. There's an agreement that it is important we look at our curriculum and think of what we'll do with it. But I want to begin by drawing our attention to one point, which is the state which history found itself. It was so disturbing in about the 1990s. The condition was so disturbing in such that history departments found themselves roaming around in Nigeria looking for applicants. I was an admission officer in my university, so we had to wait until after admission has been completed, and then we'll be waiting for those who will have no admission. And then they will rush and come and give me whatever course. Yes. Applicants will come and be saying that no problem, I will take history now, no problem. So there's a course, I'm still teaching the course, Introduction to the Study of History. What I normally do is whenever I enter to give the first lecture, I will ask them, how many people apply to read history? You find it is only 1 or 2 people. But I will say the door is open. Whoever is not interested, let him go out. Then they will laugh and say, no, we're interested. I say, okay, now relax and accept history, because we want to begin to study history now. There's no more saying that I want to change to another course. You are now history students. Relax and take it. That is your own fate. Yes, I said that is a faith. But I will also go ahead to tell them that history has a significance. And I would ask the person who wants to be called a bastard. And everybody will say, no, 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 no. I said, if you don't want to be called a bastard, then you need history so that you can know who is your father. You can know where you come from. So it's just a way of trying to get them to accept. You understand, not to be thinking that in the second year, I will change to political science, I will change to any other course. Say, no, you're not going anywhere. If you want to leave, leave now. The moment we finish 1 year, there's no opening for you to go. So it was as bad as that to history. And the presentations have made it clear why it reached to that level. At a point, the whole teaching of history was scrapped. Nigeria, teaching of history, especially teaching of history education, which led us to not having even the teachers to teach in secondary schools. So for long, we've been without teachers in secondary schools. Therefore, without applicants to read history at university level. So this is was one of the big challenge, which I think it's important we put it into record so that in our discussion about curriculum, we think of what to add to it. My second point is that a discussion of curriculum change shouldn't just stop at the level of introduction of courses. I think it should go beyond that. But what to teach in the course? As in, part of the problem is not the course, but what to teach. How can we make our teaching so interesting to enable the student to understand themselves, understand what they are studying, and to be able to think of how to make improvement, how to initiate, and how to improve in what they are studying. One other point which I want to talk about is there's one point I think which we're not giving attention to. How do we make history marketable, a historian marketable? Is just our curriculum about introducing courses or changing curriculum to go with the changes in the society? Or is it also about trying to make our graduates to have something doing? Because that's what they normally ask us. If I read history, what will I do with it? That is the question always. Whenever students come, new ones and old ones are about to graduate, okay, what do I do with history? And I think our teaching should produce students so creative enough to develop the skill in them so much so that they can use that particular skill to come up with something. So my presentation this evening is looking at those key questions which our concept paper raised. These questions are, for example, how can we think together about teaching in the 21st century? How can we think together about teaching in the 21st century history department? How should we change the content of our classes? Which subjects can we focus on for new generations of students? Should we also change the way we teach? In other words, curriculum reform is not only about the new subjects we like to teach, but also about our pedagogy and method of assessment. So my presentation is an attempt to provide answers to these specific questions. I begin by the first question, which said that, how can we think together about teaching in the 21st century history department? And my answer is that history is too important to be neglected. 21st century is not 20th or 19th or 17th century. We must therefore do something about it. We must work together to propose a design that fits the century. This cannot be achieved unless we come to terms with an accepted working definition of the meaning of history. We must have a shared understanding. So it's simply saying that whatever we're going to put together must begin by having a clear understanding of what the meaning of history is. So I said, coming with an accepted meaning has been a big problem among the Nigerian universities, which was why the concern became just to attract students into the department. What I'm simply saying is that at a point, it became so difficult to have a common understanding, so much so that certain departments resolved, because it happened in 1990 during the Congress of Historical Society in Abuja, the debate about what do we do with history. And that was from where the department started to think about what is good is to change name. So historians started to become people who deceiving students to go into history department, thinking that they're going to study history and diplomatic studies, history and this, history and that. And we're saying that no, the issue is not about nomenclature. The issue is about what do you understand by history? Is your understanding of history about to inform you to understand your own condition and how to change it? Or is it just a mere storytelling? Is your understanding of history just telling stories about what happened without justification? Is your understanding of history just about narrating what happened without understanding the forces behind why it happened? What is history to teach us? In my university and some other universities, we insisted no, we remain Department of History. But we insist that what we teach as history must develop the skill in the student to understand himself, to understand his society, and to be able to interpret whatever issues that come as a result. The second question is, how should we change the content of our classes? And I said that the content of what we should be teaching in our classes should be guided by the objective reality of a situation. I had a lot of people talking about objectivity and things like that. I think we should be guided by that, but more especially by the objective reality, the condition we found ourselves. We shouldn't just introduce courses that will have no meaning in our own kind of lives or in our own kind of society. We need to begin by finding out the challenges before us. For example, what are we? Why are we what we are? Where are we? And why are we where we are? Take Nigeria, for example. Why and when Nigeria became Nigeria? Questions like this are very important for our students to be able to think beyond and answer it. Did Nigeria come about in 1914? What happened in 1914? What is the formation of Nigeria about? Formation of Nigerian people, or that of Nigerian common administrative situation? We're simply saying that, what do we understand by 1914? Do we understand 1914 to be the period when Nigeria came into being? Or the period when certain development took place in the Nigerian area? Our historians must be able to be very clear about what it is, so much so that we can now understand that Nigerian people have been in existence long before 1914. Not only in existence, but relating with one another, sometimes in peace and sometimes in war, sometimes in disagreement and sometimes in agreement. Nigerian people have been together for long, engaged in one activity or the other of commerce, of migration, of marriages, and of a lot of things like that long before 1940. So 1940 cannot be the beginning of Nigeria. But 1914 should be very much understood to mean just a period when a formal administration of the whole Nigerian era was brought together. This kind of understanding will make our students to understand Nigerian history and to be able to make use of the opportunities around Nigerian history. This kind of understanding, or this study in particular, made the study of our past quite relevant. If you clearly understand that Nigerian people have been in existence long before 1914, even though there was no single country called Nigeria, you understand, it gives the understanding that people have been relating. History is all about people relating with one another. That is why we disagree with the idea of which says African people have no history because we lack the idea of writing. Oral tradition has clearly cleared that particular point. So we are simply saying that history program should therefore be designed to equip students with basic historiographical skills so as to have a proper grasp of the historical forces and development that shaped and are shaping the various aspects of human life. So this clear understanding of history will now help us equally understand the motion, the forces which produce our societies. Sometimes in 1989, I was part of a research which took us to areas around the border between Nigeria and Niger, from around Kano. And when we were taken there, we were protesting, saying that no, we can't stay in this village. And a lot of us are saying, and most of us came from Kano. But you see, in the night, when we are moving around, I met a Yoruba family, well settled in that area. Beyond being settled, engaged in an economic activity in that particular area. And when I discussed with them, they told me they've been there for long. So we're simply saying that Nigerian people have moved to places and settled for long, and they live in peace with one another, which is simply saying that the history that produced Nigeria has gone beyond 1940. So what we need to do is now to understand the fact that we need to live as a people. There are a lot of opportunities. Our students should understand that history should let us understand that there are opportunities as we accept one another, as we move among one another to all other parts of the Nigerian society. So the next question is, which subjects can we focus on for a new generation of students? So it's simply asking, okay, how do we approach our new students? So I'm saying that there's no part of our history that should be neglected. This support, what my other colleagues have said, that all other areas of our social life should be ventured into by historians. Professor Toyin Falola talked about areas of filmmaking, photography, and things like that. I supervised one student, examining one student in Usman Fodio, who wrote on photography. If you read the text, is so interesting, so voluminous, and it covers a lot of issues. All you need now is a little capital to venture into one aspect of it or the other, and you can make life. So there are a lot of issues. For example, the film industry. We have Nollywood, we have Kennywood, we have so many of them. There are so many aspects of it you can work on. For example, some of them approached me and were asking, they needed information about certain part of our history, which I think a historian can work together. History now can teach our students to understand. They can venture into such kind of areas and make a living. So it's not about going to work in government office or going to work in one defined office that you're wanting to be paid salary every month, but also to understand that no, if you have the skill you can venture into any field and make a living out of it. Also, knowledge is about how we come to be what we are. Knowledge is about working together as a union. Knowledge is indeed about teaching people to have a clear mode of instruction. So what we need is not only change of course or introduction of new courses, but also a methodology of understanding who we are, what we are, and how we become what we are. So it is about working in the minds of our younger students to understand that they are first of all human beings. Before becoming a Hausa man, a Yoruba man, a Muslim, or a Christian. Our students must understand this basic fact. All of us are first of all human beings. You don't find a Muslim in donkeys or in rams or in sheep or whatever. Nor do you find Christian in horses and what is in human being. So before anything, our students should understand that they are human beings. If all of us now can take each other, first of all, as human beings, not as Hausa or Yoruba or Igbo or whatever, we'll be able to understand ourselves, work together, and then achieve whatever we want to achieve. So there's no part of knowledge that is not important, but what is more important is for our students to understand that we're dealing with human beings, and you must be human first before you can acquire any identity, whatever that identity is. You are human first. So if all of us now will look at one another as human beings, we're going to live in peace, and we're going to enjoy one another, and we're going to be able to explore all the opportunities around us without any rancor, without any difficulty, without any challenge. People can move from as far as you can like in Nigerian area and enjoy whatever opportunity is there, so long as that peaceful coexistence is built in. But our teaching of history should now try to make sure that it venture into the teaching so as to socialize our younger ones to understand this oneness, this unity. It's lack of this unity that is causing a lot of problem, and is caging us to be thinking more like a Southerner, a Northerner, a Westerner, a Hausa, a Yoruba, a Muslim, a Christian. You understand? Imprisoning ourselves instead of working together to achieve whatever you want to achieve. And the last question is, should we also change the way we teach? Yes. To be frank, we have to work on the way we teach. We have to try and change because we can't achieve what we want without changing how we teach. The way we teach history is not helping matters. As a number of people have said, history is about what happened, whether you like it or not, it happened. But in the process of teaching what happened, we also have to be as objective as possible, so that we can guide our younger ones properly to accept one another, and to have a country that can call itself that name. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I am positing that it is only when the above kind of understanding is appreciated that curriculum reform can make any meaning to whatever we are thinking of. It's only when this is appreciated that curriculum reform will mean more than just the introduction of new courses, but also that the mode of instruction, the method of teaching, the method of assessment should also be worked on. We have a very long history that we must appreciate that history. we read about the Oyo Empire, we read about the kingdoms and chiefdoms and empires and states that existed in the Nigerian area. But we never took cognizance of how far they manage themselves as polities, how far they manage themselves as members of an economy, and how far they related with one another, which created long distance trade, which they enjoyed during that period of time, providing security and providing even means of exchange and other kind of facilities of necessity. Our teaching of history should therefore help us explain the forces that brought these empires, this system into force. It should extend to be able to record the role played by the common people, including women and every other members of the larger community, not only the kings, the rich people, not only palaces, but also markets. It should now go beyond just looking at people of some note, to also other people within the society, including the downtrodden masses of the society. Our teaching of history must lead us to understand all forms of relations, including relations of war between communities, as well as that of trade and commerce, migration and establishment of settlements, marriages, and so on and so forth. It is this form of the teaching of history that will produce a historian productive enough to see the available resources Nigerian environment is endowed with and make use of it. So finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm saying that what we need beyond just changes in the courses is changing in the way and what we teach. All we need to do is to develop that skill in our younger ones to be able to understand society, interpret society, and change society. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Nagode. Thanks a lot for that. And I can see that Professor Falola is back with us, or actually never left. He never sleeps. Prof, would you like to make a comment, actually? To make a comment? Because I think the two speakers today just addressed your paper directly. Would you like to say something, Prof? Sorry?
I didn't leave. I've never left. I've listened to everyone. I just leave the video, but I listened to Professor Adeshina Alao, Lukuju, and other ones. If there is time, Vincent, will it be possible to ask those in the audience just to give us 1 point each? They don't have to explain it, just one sentence, so that we can create a takeaway. You can appeal to them that they should not expand on the point. They should just make the point. We list them and we accumulate them as the great takeaway of this conference. So there's a consensus on what Professor Akin will make a platform. There's a consensus on that. For instance, if you look at the big man who ran as presidential candidate, the guy who created Ovation, what he did was to turn Yoruba, his being Yoruba at Ife, into a big magnet. If you look at Macaroni, he turned theater, moving away from showing Kan Yerima and a Shofisans structure to go into skits. So there's somebody in this room, there's one of your students who is going to become rich, who is going to be able to convert this history into a market because it's convertible. There's somebody whether in Sokoto or Kano, that we eventually do this. So if you can all accumulate these ideas, one sentence each, we all benefit from this great symposium. That's my suggestion.
Okay.
Yes, now I can hear now.
Oh, okay.
Now I can hear.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you, Professor Gwadabe, for your presentation. I am particularly intrigued by some of the issues you have raised, but the most important one for me is where you have said we should work on the minds of our students to appreciate the nature of history, the tools of history, and the significance of history. But the question is, how do we do that?
Okay.
Especially in this day and age, when the students themselves have access to all kinds of tools, especially the social media, the internet. And there is always a question that precedes whatever we teach in class. I am not sure you have, well, I don't know whether you have noticed that, because I have. That question is, and so what? And so what? So how do we begin to answer the and so what questions? Yeah, Professor Falala has just said some people are going to make things out of history we are going to teach. Yes, I have had one or two who went into documentaries, and she did very well until she was offered a banking job and she dropped the documentaries. So there are issues. There are issues. So how do we begin to answer the and so what questions? You have to know the history of your father or great grandfathers and your town. And then he looks at you and say, and so what? What's the use? So how do we begin to affect the minds of the students? If you are not interested, you are not interested. So how do we, yes, for 2 or 3 out of 150 who chose history willingly, we understand. But the 147 in that class, how do you propose to convince them over the and so what question? Thank you very much.
Is it directed at me or is it for the audience? The technology is creating this problem because you can't hear me again. You can hear me. So in Nigeria, people are very religious. Professor Adeshina is also a religious person. I know that to be true. So his question has been answered in the Quran and the Bible. The conversion to Paul. There are so many conversion stories in the Holy Quran, in the Bible, in which you are not a believer and you become a believer, which is a process. So you and I have to work on that process. Do you know his comment has led to another conference, which Dr. Jimo and Vincent should do? We bring these students together. Let's bring the students together and let them talk, and we listen. And we pose a question: how do we improve this discipline for you? With due respect, Professor Adeshina, if you go to your chemistry department or your physics department, they will say the same thing. They will say, okay, what do you want me to do with chemistry? So we are not alone because we are dealing with the larger context. You and I are not responsible for failed politics, for the failing state, for dysfunctional economy. You and I are not winning, but we are going to be part of the victims of that. And our students will be part of the victims of that. If there is no corruption, if they did not steal Nigerians' money, if they develop, many of what we worry about will just disappear because there will be things for those who have this degree to do so that they will reduce that kind of doubts. But for now, if they look at, I went to the university at Akumba And the students at the convocation were saying, what is the worth of this degree? And you find the general orientation that education is a scam. And they would think it's a scam because they don't know what to do with the degrees. So that the ultimate solution now is to say, how can I check out of the country? So I appreciate what you have said, but you and I, we didn't create this problem. And as I said, you are doing your work at a very difficult time when you have not even paid salary. So some of our colleagues will also ask themselves, why are they in this profession? They have to ask themselves a question. If a profession cannot give you enough money to send your children to school, cannot let you maintain your household, you are daily fighting with your spouses. So you are going to say, and so what? So I can understand what you are going through.
Thank you. I think Prof. Olukuju has a question as well, or as a comment online, please.
Oh, there's one for me?
No, Prof. Olukuju would like to speak, please.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe I should unmute myself both ways. Okay, no problem. I want to address the question of how to get our students interested in history as a discipline. And I want to cite the example of the University of Lagos, where I teach. As part of the reform of our curriculum, we've introduced, and we have taught over several years, a course on Introduction to History. And it's a 100-level course. And that course is handled by a professor, usually the most senior professor in the department. We not only talk about what they will do, we'll talk about the record of our department. Those who have served in various capacities, and those who have graduated from a department, who are working in different places all over the world. So we give them practical examples of what we as a department have achieved by studying history and what our products are doing outside elsewhere. In other words, it is more or less like a way of breaking them into the discipline, because we realize that many of them studied government and other subjects, government social studies and all that. So we take them through a process, an entire semester of introducing them to the department and to the discipline of history. And the response we have is that many of them they didn't know the virtue of history until we took them through that course. So I think it's a sort of orientation that has to start from within. And then, of course, we need to bring back our alumni to interact with those who are there. And when we are doing that at the University of Lagos at the moment. So I think that it's like a conversion process. It's like you're an evangelist. Start the evangelization process from within, from the very first semester, the very first week of the enrollment of those students in the department. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw there's a question at the back. Oh, sorry. There was one here before. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much. I think my name is Akintunde Bobwe. I'm at the Institute of African Studies here, Cultural and Media Studies. So this problem, I think is a very fundamental problem that is germane to the humanities. Having to make whatever it is that comes out of the humanities marketable in such a way that youths and students are very interested in it. And I think the very solution will be in the creative industry. How do you make this thing fun? How do you make it a revenue generating thing for people? And that's why I think, well, that's why I'm doing my projecting, and that's where I'm trying to structure my argument towards. So I think we should start to look into the creative industry.
I'm Adeolu Abe from Ondo. I'm not really in history, but I'm interested in this roundtable program because I like history, and I do history of music, theater, arts. Good. Now, like those who've spoken before me said, the creativity in converting whatever we are doing, to make it interesting to the younger ones. Now, the mind of the average young one is thinking of how to make money. That's why they will always talk about education is scam. All right. One of the things we do or I do in music, apart from just being a musician, presently I'm working with the University of Medical Sciences in Ondo, trying to take music to solving problems in the medical field, music therapy. That's one of those things. I've written a proposal to the university of how we can use music to solve problems, music entrepreneurship, and some other things. The HOD mentioned something the other time, talking about someone who can use history for documentary. There are so many other ways, trying to look at history in the cyberspace and so many other things, how it can turn out to become money-making venture for them will solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor, and I'm also not an historian, but I'm from the Department of Public Health, Global Health and Humanitarianism. And I actually love history because I have a lot of my friends who complains a lot that what they experience in their lecture rooms is just a lecturer coming into the class and bore them with a lot of materials. So if I may suggest, I don't know if we can adopt this action of we having a pictorial reference of every lecture note, or maybe some lecture notes, because a lot of students these days, we get attracted to realities, and I believe history is about realities. So if we can adopt this at a particular point in our lectures, and I believe the students, and as the last professor has said earlier, he said it's not everyone that that were accepted into history that are registered for history. So majority of them didn't come into history to have convenient time there, but they just want to see how that course will take them, where it will take them to. And this is just my own suggestion about the teaching strategy. Please.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just trying to attempt to respond to this question. I think my thought is going in line with saying that it's better you teach someone how to fish than to give him fish. I think if historians or the teaching of history will insist on developing the skill in somebody to be able to critically think, whatever you see him beyond what your eye is seeing. You understand? Be as critical as that. Think of how you get water, they say, is from is it rock or whatever. And most of this spring water we get, the best water we drink. And if only you tell somebody this is how water is gotten, it will be difficult for him to understand. So we should teach people to be as critical as possible, so much so that they'll be thinking beyond asking you, what do I do with the knowledge? No, they know what to do with the knowledge. Because asking you, so what, is simply saying that this guy is not even, he has not gone beyond any study. It's back to you to tell him what to do. Our teaching should be as much as possible, instill in the learner the ability to critically think. You understand? When we have been taught by Bala Usman, this history 101, and he said, whenever you go out, you see people running, don't run. Wait and see the direction they are going to and why they are going to that direction, so that you know which direction to go to. Yes, otherwise you end up going to the monster without knowing that. So we should teach us to be as critical as that. Whatever comes to them, they should assess it before they take action. Somebody come and tell you that Mr. A is abusing your father, and you just go and begin to fight him. Ask yourself, why should he abuse my father? Did he abuse my father before me? Is it true that he abused my father? Keep asking questions to make sure that it is telling you you have to be attentive before you can take any action. It is that kind of knowledge which will now help you to know what to do with what you learn. But I'm telling you, there are so many opportunities around. All you need to do is to think beyond your nose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll keep going back and forth on this subject because if we don't get the foundational problem that we're facing, and I think that's more of how to engage those who are graduating from the university and how to make them dependable and how to make ends meet individually. And I think that's the reason why we keep going back to this idea of make a particular course relevant, so that it will have immediate effect, immediate instrumental effect, so that it could meet the instrumental need of an individual. And if we go back to say the origin of disciplines, for instance, go back to the period of when philosophizing was seen more as a leisure. So you had a number of things settled, and then you sit back to philosophize. Then you wouldn't necessarily need to bother about how far can this thinking take me? Would this provide bread for me? Would this provide certain things for me? And I think that also dovetails into other disciplines, even in the sciences. Prof would agree with, Professor Farrell would agree with you that even in the US, a place you consider to be a hub of so much, of plethora intellectual productions, that disciplines still have to be sustained by enormous funding, such that you don't necessarily need to say, well, within this period of taking this PhD, would I be able to meet up with certain prerequisite needs at the immediate point in time? So if that is settled, then perhaps you will sit back and then engage the discipline as deeply as possible. Because I think there is no amount of intervention of the, say, let's make it attractive, let's make it, no amount of that would necessarily enrich what history is or what history ought to be. And the same goes for philosophy. I mean, philosophy, I know what I'm talking about in that sense, because the very first question a number of persons ask, even when we were undergraduate students in IFE, was, what can I do with philosophy? And that had become a perennial question for every newcomer into the discipline. So I think by moving intellectual production away from the basis of, say, leisure, and then willingness to just engage in critical thoughts, to what can this provide for me in the immediate future. I think that is a major bane of contention here. And I think that goes, I mean, Femi Taiwo has also raised this point as well. He said he is not, that his job is to teach, that he is there to be a form of incubator for thought, but he's not a job creator. So when we get to that point of know that even useless knowledge, right? For those who say, well, history is too turgid, that even what you consider as useless knowledge is still knowledge in itself, then I think we will make headway. But when the material basis is missing, that sense of what would I do after graduating, I think we'll keep going back to this form of let's make it attractive so that people can come in and study the course. Thank you.
Hello. Yes.
Thank you. I think the point has been made, and we have come to this critical junction to ask the important question of what should drive curriculum reform in history. What are those things that should be of concern to us, and how do we order them? Are we pursuing curriculum reform in history just to create jobs for historians? Are we pursuing this to produce knowledge and take advantage of the knowledge that you produce? Or are we doing this to promote public administration, especially nation building in Nigeria? What should drive curriculum reform in Nigeria? And I think it's a very central question. Thank you.
Very good question. Anyone else, maybe? There was one question in the chat about the feasibility of field trips from Evarista. How can we go do field trips if, well, basically the situation is not safe? I just summarized Evarista's question. Well, who would like to answer this question? Anyone? I wish I knew myself. Yes, yes. Any other comments, maybe from the room? Oh, please, Prof.
On the issue of field trips, we cannot jeopardize the safety of our students if the security atmosphere is not conducive. But say we can look for alternatives within our immediate environment. When I couldn't take my students outside Lagos, I had to look for places we can go within Lagos. And that is what we do now. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Mine is not question, but a challenge to heads of departments, deans. When you look at classrooms in Nigeria, you see, look at these chalkboards and what have you. I think we should start thinking about digital board where you can actually make students to be interested in history, because you are talking about Oyo Empire or Sokoto Caliphate. You can actually punch your board and take students through the maps by giving them that pictorial analysis rather than coming to class with your 19th century files and what have you. So I think the HODs, the deans can actually make recommendations to, because some of these issues we are raising here goes back to the administrators as well, by making funds available for departments to go digital. The more digital you are, the better for the students.
Sorry, I don't want this to be a dialogue between two. But you see, I am also an administrator. It goes beyond that. If you have a digital board and there is no power, there is no Wi-Fi. I mean, they will turn your digital board to a whiteboard and you will see them using permanent markers to be writing on your digital board. So we need to take this thing holistically. There must be power supply, current power supply. When I was HOD, I had to go to solicit. It was Chevron that donated digital boards to my department, and we fixed it in our classrooms. Then there was no Wi-Fi. It was so epileptic, and then power cut, and they made a show of the digital board. I was so frustrated. So we now said, okay, we will get somebody to help us again and put Wi-Fi there. But the power, we have no control because I cannot bring generator to the faculty. The university authorities, they don't allow that. So we look at all these things together. So then power issue is a big issue in the country now. It's a very big issue. So these are the things that administrators fight with. Even money to provide these resources. Vice chancellors go cap in hand to Abuja for every little expense. The budget of the university that is there, money is not forthcoming. When you prepare your budget and at the end of the day, what will be released from Abuja for federal universities to work with is a fraction. And then that fraction, they will tell you first quarter, you cannot spend anything. And so how do we survive? You go outside seeking donations from people, donations to buy fans, to repair everything. That is the way we operate. So it's not a simple thing because of the environment in which we find ourselves. And then our alumni have been doing so well. A lot of times when we are really short of funds, we go to the alumni, please come back and give back. And they come in and pick one or two things they need to do to make us to continue to function.
Thank you. I just a kind of rider to what she has said. It was an experience I had when I was given a 100 level course, Major World Civilization, about 5 years ago. So what I did was, because we have this Chinese civilization, the Great Walls, so I documented those in my system, and the Egyptian pyramids. So when the student came as fresh student, I asked them to come to my office because that is where I had the network. So I started showing them. So that year, the next year, I noticed a lot of students from Islamic studies borrowed my course. So I had a bigger class because of that thing I did. So I think we should just inculcate that. I just use that as an example. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Oluwasomi Hayomide, a graduate student at this institute, Diaspora and Transnational Studies Unit. I just want to say it's more of like a socio-economic problem. Look at the state of the country now. There's high immiseration, underdevelopment, 40% unemployment rate for youths. So you can't just expect young people who are exposed to such statistics to love education. Like people who are disillusioned with education generally. Like people, most of our mates now, some of them don't even want to go to university. They just want to study coding, tech, data science, because they feel the government has no such power over that. It's not that they want to go to government ministries to look for a job. So they prefer to go even to the tech because they feel they have more opportunities. So I don't think it's more of like the problem lies with the academic. It's more of even the government. The government even has a role to play with it. I studied classics for my undergraduate, and I can tell you boldly that people, the situation that we are currently discussing even affects them more than even there are people in history, because people are just feel like they have no future here in classics because they feel there's no job, there's nothing you can do with it. Whereas assuming there are jobs out there, assuming there are things like employment things that people can do, that the government can provide for people. People who love these things, people who get more interested in education. So the problem is pervades even the education sector generally. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes, you got a question, last question? I don't have questions in front of me. Maybe your last question, please, and after we're gonna have a quick break, okay?
Good afternoon. My name is Ayo Lamubodi. Okay. Concerning what Professor Alao talked about just now, my mind went to the place of what if history, for example, has a skill that is solving. Do you get my point? Now, my point is this. When you look at what operates in Nigeria right now, they say pick up a skill. Do you understand? You pick up graphic design and all this stuff. Do you understand? Now, let's narrow it down to history itself. Is there a skill that you, as a student of history, will be able to pick up and then is also solving a problem in the society? Do you understand? So that is what we should also emphasize on. Like what Prof also said, that, okay, are we looking at this point or the other point? Let's keep it open as possible and let's break it down that, okay, for example, let's say 100 level, we're taking these courses, this other part, we're taking these courses, this other part, we're taking these courses. I'll also give you an example of myself. I went to a private university and 400 level, we were told to take entrepreneurship. Do you understand? So it was just a means to also let us understand that, okay, if you feel you are not fine with the course you're doing right now, you can pick up a skill in entrepreneurship, stop making whatever like that you might now add to what you really want to do. So that's my own submission. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think that is where the problem is. When you're talking about skills, we are talking about skills within the discipline. Skills that will enable you apply the knowledge you have acquired in that discipline. I question the commitment of government and the tendency of government to ask graduate students to pick up skills in blacksmithing, in photography, in this and that. No, you must pick up skills that are relevant to your discipline and where you can apply the knowledge that you have acquired in your respective disciplines. Take the example of an historian. You have been taught to interpret documents. You can go into documentary. You can do script writing. You can do ghost writing. You can go into publication. These are skills that are relevant within the discipline of history. And we shouldn't buy the idea of the Bretton Woods institutions trying to reduce every Nigerian graduate to everyday craftsmen and women. No, it's not the way to go. What we are trying to do is to add value to the knowledge that we have acquired in this respective discipline, especially history. And our curriculum must encourage us to do this. That's why when you are on excursion or field trip, you could be taken to places of production where you can understand what they are doing and become later in life a scriptwriter. You can even generate content for all the organizations that you have around, and it will add value to the knowledge that you have acquired, and will not start from the beginning again. It's like adding value to what you already have. And I think that is where skill acquisition should come in, not going into bakery, barbing, and all whatnot. Thank you.
One footnote.
As a footnote to what Professor Alao has said, history is supposed to be a discipline that trains the mind. The skills you learn from history are expected to become readily available beyond even history itself. You are a student of society. If you go into business, for instance, with the knowledge you have learned from history and your capacity to understand what is needed somewhere, how much you are going to get it from somewhere, you discover that all these skills are already embedded in history. So kindly settle down. That's my advice. Settle down into understanding what history is saying. For over 1,000 years, people went into trans-Saharan trade. They didn't get an MBA. So, they didn't get an MBA. So learn from the past and from the present how you can understand society and make society better. It's not every course, every discipline that is expected to give you hands-on experience. But even if you are looking for hands-on experience, history can take you in the direction of documentaries, can take you in the direction of historic sites. And that's what I said I did with the course at Bowen. I did in tourism. In future, very soon, I am sure we are going to get our acts together once the insecurity problem has been solved, and we begin to put together our historic sites. We give jobs to younger Nigerians as, what do they call them? There is guides. It's there. It's there. So don't look at history as, well, I could have been an MBA person or a lawyer. No, we have different things to do and different reasons for being in existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Can I ask, well, actually, I can give you 10 minutes before a break. But if you're interested, you can have a drink in the foyer, not in the same room as before. Just go left and turn right. You can get a drink. And can I ask you then to come back at 4 o'clock? Is that okay? Then our colleagues from the UK will be able to get the papers. Thank you.
Don't sleep, wake up. Collect your money, wake up. Collect your money, wake up. Tera, go get the moolah. Wake up, Konito kala, don't walk, you don't try. You supposed to be jai. Kill up, come, become person, person we don't mind. Boy, when I land softly on the sofa floor. So far, so good, Konita Joe. Let me see you, go lo. Let me see you, go lo. Put down, let me put down.
Outside where they feed man's oboe. Oh no, I mean I stand the defender like Joseph Yobo. But girl say she want Netflix and chill, so I chatty get even warning. If you fall in love, Kelly satin. You go to breakfast, I'm not capping. Can you see dripple, I'm not catching. I'm not faking this, no fugazi. You see these feelings, I'm not catching.
Welcome back, everyone. So thank you for staying until the end to our last panel. So I'm very lucky because my colleagues from London just came. They arrived on Saturday morning from Lagos, and some of them on Monday morning. We all come from King's College London, and the coincidence you might be aware of, or you might not be aware of, is that Kenneth Dike himself did his history PhD in the department where we teach. So there's a kind of a link between us, albeit small, but it's an interesting coincidence. Why did I want to have our colleagues to talk about this? Because actually we talk quite a lot about changing our curricula in the UK, about decolonizing our curriculum. And just to give you an idea of what people do basically in England at the moment, that's to give you this kind of flavor and to carry on the conversation, or to see what the conversation is like basically in the UK. Okay. Dr. Harris, would you like to come, please? Thank you.
Yep, I will. Thank you very much, Vincent. And I've got some slides, so I'm going to sit slightly at an angle so I can see my slides. That's okay. I have pictures, you see, using the visual. So wonderful. Thank you very much. So I proffer this effectively as an intervention from the periphery, and using some of what I've done with the teaching of British history at King's as something to think with, further up to me, of course. So I've entitled this paper, Where Do We Know From? Decolonizing the History of the Metropole via Brixton. And I'll explain why through the course of this short presentation. So next slide, please. In her 2006 book, Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle, the Black geographer and gender studies scholar, Catherine McKintrick, encourages reflection on colonial and racist genealogies or epistemologies of knowledge production, and the Eurocentric imperial privileging of certain methodologies and artifacts, official documents in particular, for understanding the past. In undertaking curriculum reform, McKintrick's provocation to think about where we know from, alongside novelist Chimamanda Adichie's reflection on the dangers of a single story, and I heard resonances of that this morning, have been guiding precepts of my own efforts to reform the curriculum. So next slide, please. In 2017, recently appointed as a permanent lecturer at King's, I undertook development of a new optional module for our second-year undergraduate students to investigate the lived experiences, political activism, cultural productions, and diverse civic contributions of Black men and women in 20th century London. I entitled the module Black in the Union Jack, Black Lives in Modern London, referencing, of course, the cultural theorist and then King's colleague, he's gone to UCL now, Paul Gilroy's classic text on post-Second World War race relations. This title, however, also tacitly signaled to the continuing need to challenge within commonly circulating public narratives, but also because our students were asking us and encouraging us to have these conversations, what constituted modern British history, and a quarantining of inquiry about migration and empire to the world history modules in the department, and an amnesia, or worse, erasure, almost picking up my other colleague Angel's paper, about the constitutive properties and enduring legacies of empire in constructions of British national identity. So next slide, please. It was clear to me in this curriculum development process that my aspirations to practice an anti-racist pedagogy from my own positionality as a white, now middle class and Australian-born woman would require a radically diversified source base and creative critical reflections on where and how learning should happen. For as the Cambridge-based literary scholar Primavada Gopal has reflected in a 2021 article on decolonization and the university, an anti-colonial practice invokes a critical and radical spirit of inquiry and action, rather than a singular state to be feasibly arrived at within the modest and inevitably compromised parameters of the university. And again, I've heard elements that chime with discussions throughout the course of the day around curriculum reform being an ongoing process. So riffing on McKendrick and Adichie, I sought to structure the entire module around the pivotal considerations of where our students know from and continue to learn from, as well as ensuring that there were multiple voices and diversified narratives which speak back to imperial melancholia for an island nation or a beguiling myth of exceptional peaceful decolonization. So next slide, please. In this commitment to decolonize the classroom and provide historical tools for contemporary activism, the current condition of the British historical profession requires the enlistment of expertise from Black scholars outside the academy. Given that, as the Royal Historical Society found in 2017, in a report, in fact, that I was involved in helping to produce, around 94% of the history academics within Britain identify as white. It also requires collaboration with cultural heritage organisations and the use of digitised, diversified teaching resources, which they can provide. The initiatives of British universities and secondary schools have now been aided invaluably by the teaching tools assembled by the Runnymede Trust under the Our Migration Story website, which you'll see on the top of the screen there, in which Dr. Sandeep Linher, now a colleague at King's and a teacher on this module, played such a pivotal role. I therefore developed this experimental course in a collaborative partnership with the Black Cultural Archives, I'll call that the BCA hereafter, in Brixton, drawing extensively on their activist archive and alternating the teaching each fortnight between King's campus on the Strand and the BCA Learning Centre in South London. So my reflections this afternoon are therefore divided into two parts. Consideration, firstly, of the importance of diversified learning spaces as a mechanism for more experiential and disruptive pedagogical encounters. And secondly, the importance of access to decolonised learning and teaching resources, which can also lead to more meaningful assessment practices. This module is now run for 4 times, convened twice for myself and for the last 2 years by Dr. Lidher, and was nominated by our students for an award for King's Innovative Teaching and a prize in 2018. The next slide, please. In 1981, as media headlines depicted violent clashes between Black youth and police on the streets of Brixton, a locality of London synonymous with former Commonwealth, especially Caribbean migration to Britain since the 1950s, a small group of Black artists, activists and teachers met at a shop in Cold Harbour Lane, seen here in the top left-hand corner of the slide. They proposed the creation of an archive that would, and I quote, collect, preserve and celebrate the histories of diverse people of African and Caribbean descent in Britain. And they therefore created a charity that would, through teaching, learning and understanding of the African people's contribution, enable the public to learn and connect with hidden histories, creating an experience to uplift and inspire. This heritage activism was spearheaded by the Jamaican-born educationalist Len Garrison, seen here as a young man in the top right of the slide, and in a bust within the entrance hall of the BCA today, who asked, as a stimulus to action, where are our heroes, our martyrs, and our monuments? The resulting African People's Historical Monument Foundation remained in its Cold Harbour Lane location for 24 years, pushed out by gentrification and rising rents to Othello Close, and then to Kennington from 2005 to 2014, which you can also see those other locations on the slide, before reopening in its current location at 1 Windrush Square, Brixton. Next slide, please. So this is the BCA today, in a site with symbolic capital, given its prior history as a former Georgian mansion. It was renovated with a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund and additional monies from the Lambeth Council and London Mayor, but most importantly also by community donations, in a space befitting its aspiration to be the leading national institution for Black British history. King's students took the tube from the Strand to Brixton every fortnight to gather at the BCA, and as outlined in the aims of the module, we sought to map multiple Black spaces for conviviality, for rest, for resistance and protest in London, to explore imperial and transnational intellectual and cultural networks, to understand anti-racist protest and organisation, and to discover political associations ranging from the West African Students' Union, the League of Coloured Peoples, through to the Black Panthers in London and the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent. In this complementary classroom, as I thought of it, I worked with the Black Cultural Archives community education team and the archivist, and we brought into the module a variety of guest lecturers, community elders, activists, and educationalists. Next slide, please. The Black Cultural Archives regularly hosts exhibitions, and in the 2 years I ran the module, I could customize the curriculum to wend in these mini historical case studies into my teaching program. This was reminding me of what was said about archives and making archives attractive spaces for learning. As you'll see on this slide, the exhibitions over the years have ranged widely. Black Women in Britain was the inaugural exhibition when the building was opened in 2014. In the years I delivered the module, there were exhibitions on Black sound, exploring the musical creativity and ingenuity of Black British music, its fusions, its creolization, and its function as a site of celebration, protest, and resistance to racism, and Family Ties, which you can see in the center of the slide, based around a cache of papers from Tobuwai Adama II, Paramount Ewe Fia of Some in southeastern Ghana, I hope I pronounced that correctly, whose granddaughter donated them to the archives, and which offered an insight, a personal familial insight into colonial rule and migration spanning from 1858 to the 1950s. Next slide, please. We also moved outside the classroom. Here are the field trips that again have been referenced today, using the spaces of London itself as a laboratory for learning. 1 week of the module, spanning the liberationist politics of the 1960s through to the Brixton uprisings of 1981, consisted of a student curated walking tour. Having plotted a general itinerary from the BCA via Cold Harbour Lane to see the very first BCA premises, which now incidentally is a hip-hop chip shop, and you can see that on the right-hand side of the slide. The 2-hour seminar took place at various stopping points along Railton Road, Brixton. And Railton Road was known as the front line due to the critical concentration of anti-racist and counter-hegemonic activities centered on this very street. Commemorated just last year in this mural, which is a fantastic thing to teach with, and this mural by Jacob Joyce and Monique Jackson, and indeed created as a visual public archive, we see represented here in visual form, the lesbian artist Pearl Alcock, the C.L. James Supplementary School, the 121 Bookshop, and the Black British Panthers headquarters, all on Railton Road. Next slide, please. Students were given a building number on Railton Road and told to research and write up for presentation to their students outside. A 500-word explanation of what happened here and who lived, worked, or organised here. So depicted on this slide, they gathered at 121 Railton Road to recall the Black feminist Olive Morris, whose collective squat became the headquarters for the Brixton Black Women's Group in the 1970s and 80s. And slightly further down the road at 167, which now has the Race Today collective members celebrated on its very windows, the students found out about Darcus Howe and the Brixton Advice Centre, and afterwards read back copies of Race Today magazine at the archives. So my part in the walking tour between the student presentations was to encourage the students to think about spatial histories, how a landscape can shape action and activities, how the fabric of the urban environment itself has changed from the 1960s to the 2020s, thinking about gentrification and urban planning, but also critically about the difference it makes to think from where the Black intellectuals encountered in the module thought from. This is also a way of thinking about what it means to do history then and now outside the traditional classroom. Next slide, please. So to my second part, thinking about sources. One of the perceived difficulties, and I've underlined perceived here, in decolonizing mainstream modern British history is a lament about a lack of sources or a robust historiographical foundation for such an enterprise. The advent of Black British history as a Zachariah's 1984 classic staying power, which assembled rich, diverse source material and biographical portraits for studying the contributions of people of colour to British society in London and beyond across centuries, and the metropolitan dynamics of race and empire. More recent work, mostly originating within Black studies in the American Academy, and I think that's important, in fact, includes Mark Matera's Black London, tracing mobile diasporic Pan-African networks that sojourned in London in the interwar period, Kenyatta Hammond Perry's compelling exploration of the politics of race after the Second World War, and University of London-based Rob Waters' 2018 monograph, exploring political Blackness in Britain from 1964 to 1985. Next slide, please. It is true, however, that when I set up this module, more widely accessible sources needed to be actively sought out, and those more readily available could implicitly reinforce, if not consciously counteracted, a narrative that suggested the advent of Black Britain with the arrival of the HMS Windrush at Tilbury Dock in 1948. Before the launch of the Our Migration Story website, which now has made both these observations inaccurate and superfluous, my own solution to this problem was to collaborate with the BCA in 2016, the year before the course launched, to digitize sources from its archive and other repositories like the George Padma Institute, the Huntley Collection at the London Metropolitan Archives, and material from the National Archives in Kew, and to create a teaching source pack. Next slide, please. Through this preparatory work, the classrooms on the Strand and in Brixton were pedagogically conjoined. Both learning environments pivoted around close, tangible, and material engagement with primary source materials of marked diversity: letters, pamphlets, films, magazines and newspapers, photography, music, creative fiction, oral histories, and social surveys, alongside legislation and government documents. As I flagged in the module description, the module structure explores the ways in which Black people have lived, loved, worked, studied, played, and become politically engaged in modern London. And in foregrounding this source base, I sought to introduce students to methodological considerations about the nature of the sources needed to ask such very questions, to wrestle with lived experience, to ensure that the voices of women of colour, as well as politics more broadly conceived, a vernacular politics, was foreground in the module. I also wrestled with trying to show that this was a transnational, a global question, as well as having consequences for thinking about national histories and indeed local histories. So in this slide, you can see the students enjoying engaging with real primary source materials, as they put it. The publication here of the US Black Panthers magazine and the Black British Panthers pamphlets in this instance, which actually was looking at an analysis of the Sharpeville massacre. Next slide, please. The presence at the BCA of the archives of the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, or OAD, and the 2009 oral history project Heart of the Race, which commemorated that 1984 publication, provided 32 life histories which students could listen to and analyze, including in transcription form. This was a particular seminar highlight, especially because in the second year of running, Stella Dadsey returned to the BCA herself to reflect on her activism as a Black feminist, an anti-racist campaigner, and a socialist internationalist over 50 years. So the students had a sense of history living and modulating through the very sources that they were engaging with. Next slide, please. Alongside more traditional source analysis within a collective classroom setting, the week on policing and the 1981 Brixton uprisings deployed a more experiential pedagogy. This was a role play debate or judicial hearing at which students in groups representing the police, anti-racist activists, and community leaders and the media examined the archival files compiled around a royal commission, which was considering repeal of the Vagrancy Act of 1824, legislation used to preventatively stop and search suspect people, mostly people of colour, and hence called the sus laws. This more creative engagement with sources deployed in resourcing oral argumentation in the classroom illuminated the limits of the law, the racist logics of policing, and the stakes and status of the legal victories, the few legal victories gained by activists such as the Mangro 9. Wonderfully, some of the students that were more inhibited in classroom discussions generally, or who struggled with purely text-based analysis, flourished in this session. They were able to demonstrate their sophisticated engagement with key concepts more directly, in an embodied form, and effectively through this active engagement with source material. And for some students from successive cohorts, there was a post-module legacy. Some went on to volunteer at the BCA. A couple have used the archives in their third year dissertation topics. And one student even sought out, and this is next slide, please, I should have said. And one student even sought out a follow-up creative historical outlet, volunteering in the Stop Sus project to produce a historical graphic novel and spoken performances of creative writing and poetry, protesting racism and drawing on historical material from the BCA to think about the past and indeed the very present legacies and resonances with some of this. So yeah, it's picking up that creative point that was flagged before. So to my very final slide, please. Thank you. Finally, and very briefly, because I know as my colleague Berenice will speak more about decolonized pedagogies and creative assessments soon, the assignment used for this module before COVID lockdowns required adjustment asked students to add to the module through locating and analysing their own primary source materials. I've given you on the screen here a small sampling of some of the sources found by students on the module outside of what we dealt with at the BCA and what was in the source materials. And through this process, which I intended to give the students a sense of freedom, of ownership of their learning and co-production of the module, students reflected on the challenges and pleasures of following their interests and finding material. And I said to them in that process, I saw this as a way of continuing this process of decolonizing the curriculum and further adding to the materials for subsequent cohorts that would draw benefit from the sources that they themselves have located. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Who is next? I think it's Berenice. Yes, Berenice. Is it possible to have my colleagues' PowerPoint, please? Dr. Berenice Guyoresha will give the next paper, also from King's College London.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Well, among the many, many myriad decisions we have to take in deciding on the curriculum, one of them is whether to stand or to sit. I belong to the firmly I like to stand camp, but to each their own, I think, in this case. So could I have the first slide, please? It's the paper, the PowerPoint called Border Crossing in and Beyond the Classroom. It's not working. Okay. Well, I'll do it without a file. If anyone is interested in knowing more about what I'm talking and it feels somehow not very concrete, I'm very happy to send it to you after the talk. But hopefully you'll be able to follow me without it. So in 2017, around the same time as Alana was thinking about this marvelous course, which by the way, I would love to teach. And I think this is one of the insights. I think we all want to take each other's reformed courses. But in 2017, meanwhile, I launched a new module as well. And that was a module on the history of the Indian Ocean, which was aimed at second-year students at King's. And this is a course that covered 5,000 years of interaction and exchange between the people and cultures that lived on the Indian Ocean shore. Now, Indian Ocean studies is a very dynamic field. It's full of historiographical treasures, and historians are actively part of it because it's very much a multidisciplinary field. The Cairo Geniza, where for hundreds of years Jewish communities left their records for safekeeping, has yielded a seemingly bottomless bounty of material that tells us a lot about the day-to-day practices, the interactions, and the networks of merchants and businessmen, be they indeed Jewish, but also Muslim, Hindu, from Africa, from the Middle East, from South Asia, and the way that they plied the routes, the maritime routes between the Red Sea, the Swahili coast, and Western India. So when I was designing the course, I was spoiled for choice. And I could not possibly, in 6 months, which was the length of such a course, do justice to the sheer intensity, diversity, and richness of that Indian Ocean world. Perhaps the part of the world where the earliest forms of what we might today call globalization took root. This, however, was in many ways an opportunity. And one of the opportunities here was to do assessment differently, i.e., how do we gauge, monitor, and eventually assess students' learning? And I took that opportunity. I designed a creative assignment where students choose one port city, and then they research its history and its ties to wider Indian Ocean worlds. And they end up writing a 2,000-word piece that recreates one or several historical moments in the life of that city on the Indian Ocean. And this is followed by 1,000 words of reflection on the process and challenges, but as well the benefits of researching and writing in such a way, such a creative way, which is not something we do really when we teach history, at least not at King's. Now, as I hinted, this is not by any means a traditional history assignment. In designing it, in here, I should stress, by the way, that I didn't take this idea out of my head. This was actually inspired by seeing the wonderful creativity with which US-based academia, which is often less regimented from the top than UK academia, gives us. But when I designed this non-traditional assignment, I was taking 3 things into account. The first one is that I could assume safely that this would be most likely my students' first encounter, not just with the history of the Indian Ocean, but indeed with the history of East Africa or of the Middle East, of South Asia and Southeast Asia, as we now call these regions. Our students have a huge, huge appetite for venturing beyond Europe. And courses like this one consequently bear a huge weight of expectations that can be contradictory. So these are expectations that as teachers, we are bound to miss if we try to stick to comprehensive approaches, particularly in a field as diverse as Indian Ocean history, and considering an Indian Ocean history spans 5,000 years and more of interactions. In the case of Indian Ocean studies, my task was even more complex because we often operate from land-centric assumptions that are often very territorial. So we write from the perspective of Britain or Nigeria or India. And of course, these boundaries are quite recent, and the entire field of Indian Ocean history sort of pushes back against this idea that you have firm boundaries that contain people's lives, exchanges, and identities and actions. But my students were presumably not accustomed to thinking about beyond these geographical boundaries. The second thing I had to take into account is what did I know about who our students are? And I think this is really, really important. At King's, our students are very, very, very diverse. They go from all sorts of ethnic, religious, cultural backgrounds, life experiences, class backgrounds as well. Some of them are local students, in fact, very local from London. They might never have had a chance to travel abroad. Others had to move to London, which is a huge unfamiliar city, as they took up a BA in history. Others come from all over the world and have to adjust to very different environments. So I had to take into account that my students' experiences, their backgrounds, but also the level of knowledge and the type of interest they have in taking this course might vary. A student might choose to take my course on the Indian Ocean because it was one of the few where they could feed their interests for the Horn of Africa or Southeast Asia, which are two regions that personally I would love to have a new colleague in. Maybe we should, get up together and make a push for that. Or because they had roots, say, on one of the Indian Ocean shore. I've had students over the years from Somalia, from India, from Bahrain, etc. And perhaps, let's be honest, out of sheer inertia, because it was at the right time for them. So I would have to convince them, in other words, that Indian Ocean history is fascinating, that it has something to teach them. Last but not least, we know that the nature of assessment, the nature of how we grade an exam, in other words, determines the nature of our students' learning, i.e., the students will learn what they think they will be assessed on. And I wanted to do learning differently. Now, at King's, the history students tend to be assessed in what I call the traditional essay, which is a structured, argument-driven and historiographically explicit, ideally, answer to a question that is generally preset. The question is set for you more often than not. And it's an attempt, we want them to demonstrate mastery over the issue at stakes, historiography and history and general historical background. Now, that template of the traditional essay is, and I'm sure many of you here will recognize this, is essential for sure. But it means that if we only try this as a form of assessment, our students get little opportunity across their history degree to develop the full skill set that we need to possess as historians, certainly as professional historians. And so it makes the road, by the way, in our case, to their third year where they have to write research-based dissertations quite hard. But I also think, and here we come back to a lot of the discussion which has been about how do we preserve, in a way, the integrity of history as a discipline, but also make its relevance to students and to the wider world really apparent. Here, I thought it was really unfortunate that we stick to just one template for assessing our students, because after all, outside academia, it is our ability as historians to weave persuasive and engaging stories out of masses of material. It's our ability to couch arguments in a narrative form. It's our ability to understand, hopefully, the thoughts and the experiences of people and contexts so different from ours. And finally, I would argue, it's our ability to mix and constantly investigate the mixture of discernment and good judgment with empathy that makes historians, that makes us such versatile and sought after recruits, because at least in the UK, unlike we have the same discussions as you around, the criticism of the humanities as not being relevant. And yet when we actually look at the numbers of who gets hired, we see that historians perform very well, and we need to shout it from the rooftop, including to our students who might not be aware, because what they hear is you should be studying law, physics, or whatever, but not history. So my goal, in other words, with this assignment, was to make students conscious of the range of skills that history provides as a discipline. And I wanted, secondly, to make them confident in their ability to use and to demonstrate them. So as such, when I was designing this assignment, what I wanted to do with this creative writing piece, followed by anchored in deep historical research, followed by reflection on that process, my goal was that students be able through it to build their ability to show and not just tell us about the past. And I wanted them to understand the uses of both narrative and analysis. Secondly, I wanted them to become aware of the dynamic relationship between historical and historiographical evidence, the facts I've been talking about, or the evidence and the arguments we make, and imagination. Because after all, we use imagination at every turn as historians, including in connecting sources that, on the face of it, have nothing to do with one another, in knowing where to look in the archive, and finally, in weaving this into a story that somehow makes sense, and it is quite linear. So imagination is central. And we talk a lot at King's about the hidden curriculum. And I suggest that in that hidden curriculum, imagination is perhaps particularly hidden. It's central to our work. It's the imagination that enables us to sketch, for example, through an anecdote, entire historical worlds and processes. And it's the imagination that makes people want to read our accounts of the past and remember them. But imagination is not fiction. And knowing the difference between the two is absolutely vital. So my instruction to students were therefore to ask themselves, A, how does imagination come in to shape our approach to sources as historians? And especially when these sources are necessarily partial, fragmentary, and indeed skewed, as we know, towards a certain type of places or people and not others. Second, I wanted students to ask themselves, how do I recreate the inner worlds, the perspectives of people in a different time and place from mine, and from anything I know, with verisimilitude, not with veracity and pure accuracy, because that is, as we know, not just a wild goose chase, but it's problematic to then assert that this is the truth, but really that this is somehow anchored in verisimilitude. Third, how does one balance empathy alongside judgment as a historian? And here, maybe some of you will criticize me for this, but this is something on which I really insist personally in my own practice. I do think empathy, but empathy well deployed and critically deployed, and is actually central to what we do. Third, how do I write in a way that an audience who is unfamiliar with that place and time can connect to the past I'm telling, to the stories I'm telling, without sacrificing evidentiary rigor and depth of historical understanding? Finally, at what point does the tension between imagination and historical evidence stop being productive? Because it is a tension. In other words, what constitutes rigorous historical imagination, i.e., a form of imagination that increases our understanding of the past and our engagement with it, both within academia, in the classroom, and beyond? So as you can imagine, my students approached this when I told them for the first time, this is what you're going to do, with trepidation. We're quite scared. Where is our essay? We want to do more essays. We cannot do this. I am not a writer. I don't have imagination. I'm not creative. And frankly, if it had been me in their place, I would probably have said the same. They had, after all, never done this, and they were not used in the second year at university to being given so much agency in their second year, unless they had taken Alana's class. Suddenly, we don't give them as much agency normally over the design of what they're going to do and be assessed on. Especially given that there is still the idea that the teacher is all-knowing. But although I'm teaching the historian of the Indian Ocean, my own background, my own training is as a historian of the Indian subcontinent. So although I have developed an interest, particularly in the Western Indian Ocean to India-East Africa connection, I myself have limited knowledge here. And hiding it would not just be problematic in terms of asserting my own expertise and authority, but would prevent my students from wondering about the realms of knowledge and what is hidden and what is unknown as well. So what I wanted to emphasize with this assignment was it was students' responsibility, with my facilitation, my guidance, my support, to exercise initiative, creativity, and persistence in seeking out new knowledge on topics of their choice. So the syllabus and reading list were only a starting point. For For students to use that initiative wisely, confidently, and effectively, I prepared explicit guidelines for the development of their project. And I accompanied this with a timeline. So when they should aim to have done which task by, because it's a 10-week course. And I constantly brought the students back to these guidelines. I also provided samples of students' work who had written in the past on creative pieces on the same course. Finally, I used classroom time as an opportunity, mostly informal, for them to learn, to practice, and to hone the skills needed for the assignments. So alongside the mainstay of source analysis and seminar-style discussions, I also included exercises that model the type of historical imagination and research that I wanted. So for example, in my first class for this course, I dedicate 45 minutes to an exercise I call If I Were a Mariner. I separate the students into small groups, 4 students, and I give each group one case study about the Indian Ocean, of people sailing the Indian Ocean. One is about a Doe ship sailing towards Zanzibar in the 1850s, and the other one is a mariner on one of the ships of Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zheng He's fleet, treasure fleets as they were called, some of the biggest fleets ever assembled. And that was in the 1420s. So what I do is I give them a pack of sources, both textual but also visual. So representation of, there's for example, a rich archives of Zanzibar in the late 18th century, 19th century, which has a lot of pictures of does, of people on these does, where they were transporting, etc. I give them pictures of or drawings of sextants, of the Arab Kamal, which is a navigation exercise, implement, etc. And so I don't give them more information than this. I just tell them, this is a source pack. You have to imagine you are a sailor on that Arab doe sailing towards Zanzibar in the 1840s. And I want you to tell me a story that is somehow rooted in the sources that I've given you. And if you want, in that 45 minutes, you also are absolutely allowed and indeed encouraged to look at the, go online. And I have to say here, our students generally, luckily, which makes it that they should really consider themselves really fortunate in that way. They generally have immediately access to Wikipedia to double check something. It does mean, by the way, that if you get it wrong, they will immediately say, but that's not what it was. So it keeps us on our toes as well. Anyway, so they get together in their groups of 4 and they have to reconstruct it and tell that story. And I emphasize the story. So I don't tell, and that's why I phrase it, if I were a mariner. So in fact, initially I sort of contrive it by saying it has to be in the first person, because that way it forces them to move out of historical argument in this case, but still actually show which sources they got information from in deriving that story. And what's interesting is that by the end of these 45 minutes, the students listen to the group stories. And I imagine if it's I generally have 25 students in that class, so we generally have a bit of time to do that. If you have a bigger class, maybe you would select only a couple of groups, but the others would have had the time to do it anyway. And what they do is actually, they start sharing their stories. And those who have also shared that say, well, this is also what I found, and maybe we could have added this. And what emerges very quickly is a picture of the Indian Ocean, which, remember, is a region that presumably they have never encountered until then. And they already get the fact that this is a region that in 1420 saw some of the most incredible ship technologies of navigation, huge movements of exploration that were not driven by Europeans. They realized the huge depth of connections, including forms of the ways that these could be tied to forms of freedom and unfreedom, the richness of the trade. They start realizing that maybe the idea of globalization needs to be interrogated, and we need to ask, when does globalization start? And maybe it doesn't start in the Northern Atlantic. And they get all this from that story that I've told them. And I don't need to tell them even that. I have to say, generally, I have exercise, introducing them to the aim of the course. Generally, by the time I've ended that exercise, they have identified the aims and the core ideas of Indian Ocean history already. And I don't even need to say it. And generally much more than that. So There are many other things I do. One of them is I try to get them to engage with historical writing a lot. And to think about what is it about historical writing that makes you connect, that makes you engage, that makes you feel like somehow you are able to understand and put yourself in somebody else's shoes. In short, this non-traditional assignment required me to design the course not just around the content, but of the history of the Indian Ocean, but indeed to take students to a journey towards the assignment. And I have to say, and this is really why I'm a big champion of this, is the results all the way through, and I've taught this for 3 or 4 years now, have been absolutely excellent. Year after year, this course provides some of the most engaging, and high quality work I've seen from students. And that work is anything but generic. I have seen students write on an Islamic cleric in 14th century Mogadishu, on mid-century Bombay, through a British resident science officer aboard a Royal Navy ship, an enslaved Malagasy boy in 1782, Colombo or Batavia under Dutch colonialism in the 18th and 19th century. Students' creativity is also visible in the diversity of formats they choose to tell the story of Indian Ocean port cities. Some of them write a succession of diary entries, which also makes them think about how would one write a letter in that age. You know, for example, the presence of God in people's lives is visible in the way that the first thing you write in a letter is, if you're a Muslim merchant, praise to God. Or the way family is really important, and the way business transactions need to be rooted in some form of interpersonal connection and relationships of trust. Others write novel-like narratives, and one courageously and splendidly once floored me by writing an amazing poem on the port of Karachi in Pakistan through the centuries. And finally, I'm also struck by the quality and thoughtfulness of the reflection that students add at the end of this creative narrative. They critically engage with their own research process and their own work, their own skill set and how they develop it. And witnessing students become self-reflective learners, for example, in describing how they met the challenge of embracing history's literary qualities and becoming more confident, more agile writers, is an absolute joy. So I'll conclude by asking why that might be the case. Why do I see year after year such high quality work? And I think the most important reason, and I think a few of us have perhaps hinted at this already, is that giving students ownership of their assignment while emphasizing that their creativity entails responsibility on their part yields incredible results. The level of research I've seen each student do for each piece of work is consistently higher and of better quality than for standard essays. The very difficulties of the process end up acting as a catalyst for effort and resilience in research. And so they prepare students for becoming producers of history, not just consumers or learners. And there are many ways in which we can take this insight further, but in my opinion, one way among many others is that we can foster these qualities, these skills, and this self-awareness amongst our students. Empowering students make for better learners, in short. Sure, from our perspective as teachers, this pedagogical innovation requires careful advanced planning and ongoing communication with students. But I have to say, it took me quite a bit of work up front, but once I had set that up, teaching that course, which is very differently assigned and taught, is not much more work. And it is so much more rewarding, including because I never see the same assignment twice. Finally, and I want to end on this, I think that by helping students develop a greater awareness of the full range of skills our discipline provides and confidence in using them, we are helping them beyond their degree. I sometimes think that the way we teach and assess students at King's, and indeed beyond that in UK academia, risk reproducing just little versions of ourselves, mini historians. But the reality is that society does not need, certainly not in the UK, lots of academic historians, and indeed, and here it's the same thing in Nigeria from what you're saying, it doesn't really value us as such, certainly not the way we would like to be valued. However, Our students, for their part, may not want to follow us in the profession. Instead, they want to know how they can deploy the incredible range of skills our discipline gives them, and the confidence they can to demonstrate these skills in other contexts than the classroom. At a time when history is used and abused for political purposes in multiple countries, whether in the UK, where I work and live, or in India, which I study, where conspiracy theories are on the rise, where the digital age makes our heads swim, and where history's value as a discipline is under attack, what we can do instead, I think, is as historians to nurture people who will then bring their historical sensibility and rigor into the wider world and make it all the better for it. And to do that, I think assessment can change.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Berenice Guiresha. Thank you. I want to rethink my assessment right now, actually. I want to rethink about it. Can we have the next presentation, please? Thank you. Our next presenter is called Dr. Angel Luke O'Donnell. Oh, no slides, so you have no slides. You have slides. There should be slides on there, yes? What's it called again? What's the file called? That's not this one, that's the other one. That's our last speaker. That's the one? Okay. Seen this man before.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's been honored to be part of this discussion, this really enlivening discussion. I'm an 18th century historian of North America, and I think the contribution that I'd like to make to today's discussion is to review my experience in teaching history to an interdisciplinary audience of students who have many and various education experiences beyond history. And I'm hoping that that kind of experience of trying to capture the attention of people who might not otherwise study history, I hope it has something to say to some of the discussions around reforming the history curriculum itself. And my aim in the paper is to talk through how I make historical topics accessible and relevant to non-history students. I think this question of how to scaffold historical skills and contexts is a prompt for interrogating why history itself is valuable to university students and their learning. So this module then is a second-year module, that's second out of 3 years, called Absence and Erasure in the British and American Empire. The module contends that the imperial narratives created around Britain and America are filled with significant absences and erasures that create a distorted image that still affects our contemporary society. However, these absences and erasures are methodological issues, and they can be overcome. And so in overcoming these gaps, students will develop greater analytical sophistication at the same time that they also deepen their understanding of empire as a kind of world-shaping phenomena, right? So to discuss the topic, I want to first look at the intended learning outcomes for the module, and then closer at the ways that I'm scaffolding historical skills before concluding with a few thoughts about what this might mean for curriculum in general. And as I say, I think some of the design issues that I've been thinking through should hopefully add to the discussion about what we think a history curriculum should do. Okay, so to start, first slide, please. These are the key characteristics of the module. So this is how I intend to teach the module. Much like Berenice, I use an oceanic framework. I use the Atlantic history framework as the kind of geographical frame for discussing the issues in my module. I think situating the ocean at the center of a bigger discussion helps make sense of the potential complexity of teaching global history, and so will make the content relevant for students. Moreover, I think highlighting the indispensable connections that exist between Europe, the Americas, and Africa unsettles some of the founding assumptions that underpin modern myths about Britain and America. Second, the module concentrates on the time period about 1695 to about 1865, so the 18th and 19th centuries. And while this is based primarily on my own historical knowledge, I make the case to students that the 18th and 19th centuries are key reference points for many communities who critique the teaching of history. And this period is the starting point for topics such as the colonization of America, the Atlantic slave trade, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism, and the development of the modern state. And my aim is that we capture transformative and relevant points that have a lasting legacy for today. And finally, many of the students on this module won't be history students per se, so it's interdisciplinary. They will have a much broader educational experience. And crucially, my experience in teaching at the Liberal Arts Department at King's has taught me that designing a module for a wide variety of students actually helped me in focusing on the key learning for the students. And this is, again, as I say, will be hopefully one of the contributions about curriculum reform. And I actually think that working between disciplines, thinking about what each discipline does, its own strength and comparative advantage, right? I think it helps to refine disciplinary identity. So next slide, please. On this next slide, this is how I kind of frame the intended learning outcomes for the module. In this top bit, we talk about educational aims. You know, this is a student-facing document, but it's created for the scrutiny of my colleagues. So it's this kind of strange hybrid entity that does two things. But this is what students will do as part of the module. They'll engage with different types of sources, which may include written documents, images, sound recordings, and material objects. They'll analyze sources to recover absent or erased narratives about people who lived through and contributed to the British and American empires, and they'll collaborate with students from different departments. The top educational aim is the core of my teaching. I think one of the key skills of a student of history, irrespective of whether they're taking a history program, is how to work effectively with primary sources. And so in this module, I wanted to focus specifically on fine, detailed analytical work. That's the methodological sophistication that I think students learn through studying historical topics. I also argue that by teaching students how to read closely and do source work, then they develop a better understanding of the topic, and why I think this is a useful thing and a useful exercise. And related to the second point, because this is about close reading, then I wanted to emphasize to students, we'll be working at the level of individual experiences. So these are big phenomena, and this will structure what we're talking about, but I think the individual experiences of those provide a usefully granular view of the big imperial narratives. Big changes such as the rise of capitalism, the development of the modern state, and the Atlantic slave trade didn't happen by accident. They were all propelled forward because people did things. This module seeks to reveal to students how we can study the human lives that undermined grand changes. And in this final educational aim, I wanted to make it clear to students, this is the third point, I wanted to make it clear to students that they would be working with other students from different disciplines, so that everyone felt they had something to offer to the module, even if they hadn't studied history before. After the educational experiences, there were also intended learning outcomes. This is what I want students to know when they complete the course. So that is to understand the legacy of empire for contemporary society, discuss contributions to the modern world for members of missing communities, to improve close reading skills, and to develop new ways to apply close reading skills. I start with the kind of two content learning outcomes, those first two. This was my attempt at making history relevant to students who might not have taken a historical module before. The module looks at contemporary British and American society to ask whose history is missing and why do these absences matter. So rather than looking at the levers of power directly, this module studies these topics from the perspective of students who are commonly absent or erased from the main narrative. These absences and erasures commonly obscure contributions from African polities, Native American nations, enslaved people, women, and poor communities. In the course of the module, I want to think carefully about incorporating these missing stories into the imperial narratives and how that will deepen their understanding of the modern world itself and the society in which they live. I'll say more about that in a moment, but in the next two learning outcomes, the bottom two, I wanted to focus on the key skill that students develop over the course of the module. I frame this skill as close reading, and it will be the main activity that we do in each week. In the blurb, I explain to students that, quote, close reading skills are central to all arts, humanities, and social science degrees. So no matter your degree program, you have the skills to succeed on this module. Over the course of the module, you will broaden your perspective as a researcher, giving you a clearer picture of the legacy of empire, as well as learning new skills that you can deploy in the rest of your studies. So I wanted to appeal to them directly about what it is they could achieve by taking the module. So in history, we'd call this source work or primary source analysis. But in designing for a diverse audience of students with different disciplinary backgrounds, I wanted to call it close reading skills so that it seemed possible to succeed. However, I also wanted to expand the students' ideas about what could be read closely. This development and expansion of close reading skills is the kind of central aim of the module. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how well you think that nice noble aim actually aligns with what I intend to teach. Which brings me then to the weekly topics. If I could have the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So I'll teach the module as 10 2-hour seminars. Each will be based on a close reading exercise. I've assured the students that they don't have to have a grounding in history, as each week will begin with a short lecture from me to give contextual overview of the issues. And in preparation, students will read an article or two that discusses that week's close reading exercise. The assessment method will be a 3,000-word essay that answers a question based on one of the 10 weekly topics. The questions will require students to find and use relevant primary source material to answer the questions, and so exercise their own skills at assessing the value of what to study. And this is where kind of digital repositories are quite useful, because many of the topics that I've chosen up there have been done so because the sources are readily available and freely available. So the students can access it themselves, or if you wanted to kind of create your own, this is all readily available and can be done. My approach to scaffolding historical skills and topics is to first build up student confidence. And to do that, I start with that first session at the top there about the idea that language matters. And so it's a 1-hour lecture about the overview of the 18th and 19th century Atlantic history. Then I focus on an excerpt from James Merrill about the language that we use to describe the colonization of America. He notes that words such as discovery, old world, new world, backcountry, and wilderness all embed inherent cultural assumptions that work to marginalize Native American polities and the military supremacy that they held over the majority of American lands until well into the 19th century. My aim is to give students a crash course in the fact that filling in absence and erasure starts with the language that we use to describe history. After that first week, I also know that I want to start with a close reading of runaway slave ads. These are short newspaper advertisements paid for by slave masters in order to appeal for the capture of enslaved people. I make the case to students that they are also inadvertent biographies that preserve interesting and human details about the lives of people who are often, removed from history or otherwise represented in dehumanized ways. I've done this exercise multiple times with students before they even arrive at university, and the students are very quick to understand the issues at work. And again, I think this will be useful in building up student confidence that they can use close reading to generate historical insight. I also believe that helping students recognize their own competency in this issue will make the content more relevant to them. They gain an understanding that a big issue like the slave trade, at the same time, they're developing fine-grained analytical reading skills. Thereafter, I know where I want the module to end, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But in between, I want to kind of take on some different topics, some ways that kind of bridge those gaps, thinking about travel narratives. So these are stories often told, and asking the question, how could they know what they know? Because the thing is, they often lie about how they know what they know. Lots of people are missing. Or I want to talk about constitutions, readily available, the foundation of the modern state, and yet often missing and erased people who are a part of it. Maps are another great way. You can have a comparison of Native American maps, which are very relational, and try and think about that versus the more kind of mathematical, numerical notion. Images, just giving them to expand the notion that students might have about what can be close read. Images, therefore, can be a part of it. And even objects, which I think pose an interesting and important methodological challenge for studying the past. I also want to say that I'm also interested in using quantitative reasoning. This is my own particular interest, but I do think it's something that's quite important. So I want to talk about the idea of ghost acres. This is the idea that a lot of industrial development relied on land outside the metropolitan center. British industry especially relied on the cultivation of land, not in Britain, and in many various parts of the Atlantic. And the aim of the exercise is to help students understand the concept by reading tables and graphs, something that some students are very nervous about close reading and getting involved with. However, I also know, because they're nervous about graphs, that before they're ready to talk about economics, I want to start with a slightly more straightforward. Oh, next slide, please, sorry. So yeah, I think Ghost Takers is really interesting, but before they're, I think, ready to close read numbers, I think we can start with demographics. And the idea is to think about the difficulties of counting people and what to do with records of the numbers that we have. The state creates these numbers, but we can ask some fairly basic questions to think about the limits about what we know. Again, I'm hoping to start in a relatively straightforward way to build up student confidence in their competency to assess numbers. Numeracy and number anxiety is a potential problem for some students. And the final kind of numbers issues, which I envision to follow as economics, is to study nutrition and attempts to reconstruct the diets of the people from the 18th and 19th century. Now, this type of history largely relies on tables and graphs, but also draws on literary sources like diaries and cookbooks. And I think that's what makes this interesting for close reading, is that it entails lots of interesting workarounds and different sources brought together. And my aim in introducing this topic to students is to encourage them to think about the different ways that we can answer a question and to think about carefully about what it is we're actually measuring. And then finally, and this is the final 2 weeks. So next slide, please. Final slide. Oh, no, sorry, no, penultimate slide. Next slide. Then I want to look at the final sessions, right? So this is the final session. This is a close reading of a comic book produced by Native American artists about a project that I was involved with. The comic book narrates both a massacre that happened to a Native American community and interweaves it with the experiences of the artists learning about the massacre. So you can see there's a historical story, there's a contemporary story, and then there's a kind of intermixing of the two. And it's interesting because not only is there images, but those little eyes you can see are videos that you can click on that then kind of elaborate on what the image is trying to discuss. And I think the comic book does an interesting job putting forward the key argument of the module that the recovery of individual experiences in the British and American Empire is still an important thing to do for some members of communities that are generally overlooked in these bigger narratives. Native American polities are ignored, which gives the impression that American expansion was inevitable or that Native American activities were somehow less important for shaping the construction of the US state. So I want to use the comic book's narrative to contextualize the larger trends highlighted throughout the course of the module. But I think the significance of this final session is best understood by what we discussed in the penultimate session. Final slide, please. And in this session, I want to talk about the work of Kenneth Dike and his call to study African history according to the sources and methods that make sense to Africans. To do so, my initial plan is to compare Dike's arguments about how we study history against Hugh Trevor Roper's vision of history. I want to encourage students to critique the works. This sort of reflective practice, thinking about the history of history, is important because it encourages students to think about what they are learning and why they are learning it. I think it brings into focus the legacies of empire that are embedded into seemingly neutral things like the curriculum. Trevor Roper being a particularly egregious example of the sort of conclusions that an uncritical historian might arrive at. I want students to feel competent in evaluating their own education and to ask questions about what its utility or relevance is for them. Because I think we can answer those questions, but we can only answer them if the students ask and if they care about the answers that we give. So I think we have to kind of find a way to inspire that curiosity. Ultimately, I want my module to speak to the bigger issues around decolonizing the curriculum by focusing student attention on the way that individual experiences reveal something important about the large-scale phenomena that shape our world. I want students to develop methodological sophistication and improve their understanding that empires were created by people doing stuff. I think this sort of reflective practice will be important for keeping the study of historical topics and historical methods relevant for 21st century students. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angel. And our last speaker is Dr. Sandeep Khanna. Can we have please the last PowerPoint, please? Yes, it's last week. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming and for Vincent and for organizing. So today I will be speaking about a project that we developed at King's to help final year history students. It was a digital resource that enabled them to recover the voices and experiences of Indigenous actors and communities into their dissertation research. So this sort of builds on what Dr. Aisha was talking about earlier, sort of the issues with a single history, a single perspective, and a single narrative. Next slide, please. So historians are storytellers, you know, whether explaining our present or understanding the past on its own terms. Their work critically shapes how the past infuses our present. Within this framework, the work of the historian has the power to shape our future by informing debates and popular perceptions of our past. In recent years, historians studying empire and its aftermath have shifted the historical perspective away from the historical myth of liberal imperialism and British exceptionalism, and towards a consideration of a wider range of different experiences and perspectives. However, there are deep historical roots to how the British have curated a liberal view of empire in its attempt to legitimize the imperial project. Next slide, please. As you can see in this 19th century children's book, littered within the pages of this book is a veneration for the military might, empire, and colonialism. Next slide, please. So quite evidently, you can see British global hegemony is celebrated throughout this children's book with illustrations of tiger hunts in India, quite racist imagery of Africans in chains, and very fearsome displays of military power to excite the next generation of conquerors. Next slide, please. However, most recently, the myth of British exceptionalism, which is most prominently projected through the Second World War and embodied through certain historical characters like Winston Churchill, has occurred alongside a remarkable resurgence of jingoistic empire nostalgia in Britain, a trend that has gained renewed impetus with Brexit. Yet this is also present in very recent publications funded by the state. Next slide, please. So for instance, widely disseminated amongst British school children, you have the Platinum Jubilee Celebration book. And again, like the 19th century book you just saw, that was also funded by the state for school children. Here you have a very singular narrative of the emergence of the British nation. And it's reduced to a very celebratory narrative, providing a very specific perspective on British history. However, historical interventions have contributed to efforts in exposing and dissecting the hypocrisy that lies at the heart of liberal imperialism and the conceit of British exceptionalism, namely that the empire had as its primary function to uplift colonial subjects and spread the blessings of Western civilization to the far-flung corners of the world. Next slide, please. So most recently, historian Priya Satia, she wrote a book, Time's Monster, which I would highly recommend, stands as a unique contribution to this, in that Satia makes an impassioned case not to let historical narratives be skewed towards the perspectives of dominant actors or the adoption of analytical frameworks that are embedded within an explicitly Eurocentric perspective. Rather, what we need to do is use different voices to tell different stories and ultimately to rethink what it means to be a historian and to engage critically and imaginatively with the past. When we think about the large corpus of literature that concerns the era of empire and decolonization, often the experience of colonial subjects is framed and understood through predominantly white Western eyes, often those of the ruling elites, including political actors or administrators. Of course, we must acknowledge that there is a rich literature written from all kinds of perspectives, as well as, of course, area studies from the contributions from African and Asian scholars themselves that have sought to redefine this narrative. Through building on these significant historical contributions, there has been increased efforts to rectify the great imbalance in the historiography of the British Empire and its legacies, by bringing in the neglected perspectives of marginalized actors more firmly into our approaches to historical research, writing and teaching. Perhaps of most significance here is that when we think and study the legacies of empire, they cannot be judged by a single factor, cause, or experience, or ascribed to a single class or type of people. Rather, there were a myriad of factors, causes, and experiences that need to be investigated. Whilst empires had a strong, enduring impact throughout history and across societies, on a global scale, their demise equally continues to shape and haunt the present in new and unpredicted ways. So when we think about the histories of the British Empire, less prominent are the voices, experiences, and perspectives of the colonized. This is by no means a recent conversation, but one that started many decades ago. The rise of subaltern studies and the creation of universities across the post-colonial world could be seen as a direct response to this challenge. By focusing on the perspectives of colonial officials, that imperialism was a politically and morally legitimate form of rule. Historians have subverted the efforts, labor, and agency of generations of colonized actors who fought to end empire on the grounds that it was illegitimate, and whose collective actions transformed the world in the 20th century during the era of decolonization. Whilst perspective is important, a question that continues to hang over this is, how do we as researchers at the undergraduate or postgraduate levels who conduct very short and focused research projects, how do we engage with a diverse set of perspectives in the research methods that we adopt, which can often be based on very narrow and limited source material that in the case of King's is predominantly drawn from British archives. So this is unlike professional academics and historians and PhD students who can now travel overseas and make use of multiple archives and whose research methods are not based on narrow source material. Access to resources is of crucial importance in shaping the narratives historians at all levels write. Of course, undergraduate and postgraduate students do recognize the value that a variety of materials, but they don't have access to them as easily as other historians at other levels might do. This reflects a broader problem that confronts all scholars of empire, world, and global history, that these projects are very expensive. Issues of access have been both exacerbated and improved with the COVID-19 global pandemic. Whilst the pandemic has made it more difficult to access archival material because of global lockdowns, yet fortunately it did also encourage digitalization projects, like the one just going on down the corridor here. As you will see later in this talk, within the department at King's, it does facilitate access to a diverse range of sources to fulfill research agendas that seek to incorporate a diverse range of perspectives. The Decolonized Digital Journal being one of various initiatives to provide a very practical resource that enables undergraduate students to access freely available archival material that isn't behind a paywall and that they can access anywhere from their computer within the digital space. Whilst historians continue, though, to debate the balance sheet approach, where the past is reduced to a historical and oversimplistic, moralistic notions of good and bad. Next slide, please. Historians, like one of my former supervisors, Kim Wagner, have argued that the so-called balance sheet approach is not and never was a genuine tool for historical analysis. Simply put, it is not part of the historian's analytical toolkit. Instead, it has always intended as a way to deflect, critique, and redeem the empire. By using this framework, we are uncritically endorsing an approach long favored by those seeking to nurture an unapologetic and nostalgia for empire and its legacies, culminating in a very rosy national historical narrative. For instance, British imperial history becomes rooted in national and imperial sentiment, where the inner virtue of the British Empire is conceptualized and projected as an engine of emancipation, liberalism, progress, and justice. It's not that historians have ignored the benefits of empire, rather they have specified them to point out on whose behalf they operated. The balance sheet approach has been shown to be entirely incompatible with a dispassionate and nuanced historical inquiry that actively encourages a critical appraisal of the history and legacies of empire. It is clear the damage that such an approach can have when we desire to shift away from the British or Western perspective to understand a more wider range of perspectives. Next slide, please. So the problem with weighing the pros and cons is that it presumes that there is a point at which the story is over. The accounts are closed and we can add up the balance, when in fact, we all know that the story is never over. In fact, more than half a century after the British Empire entered its endgame, historians are nowhere near a full assessment of the carnage shrouded by its administrators, bonfires of documents as they prepared for the last boat out. The key question here remains is, what is the story we want to tell about empire and their legacies and the era of decolonization? In recent years, universities across the UK have become a site on which the culture wars have most powerfully intersected with imperial memory and nostalgia. There are certain academics who argue in favor of adopting this so-called balance sheet framework to understand the legacies of the liberal empire project. Next slide, please. And you can actually see this in a quote from one such academic on the slide. However, other historians like Peter Mitchell have argued that this has emerged from imperial nostalgia. We can see a vivid example of this during the March 2020 COVID-19 lockdown, when the texture of everyday British life seemed for a while to be infused with the language, songs, and imagery of the Second World War. Next slide, please. So here is an image of Sir Captain Tom Moore. He was a 100-year-old veteran who undertook to do laps of his garden to raise money for the NHS. He went on to raise over £35 million, and he was transformed into a sort of national mascot. Officially inducted into a regiment of the British Army, painted by a royal portraitist, the subject of public artwork throughout the country, and the recipient of a hastily arranged knighthood. Captain Tom was strenuously invoked as a living link between the war and the pandemic, a kind of proof that a living national spirit endured and would prevail before us. But today I'm not here to talk about Britain's Second World War nostalgia, rather to emphasize how it underwrites some of the historical contortions from which conservative politics approaches the matter of teaching empire and its legacies, such as the familiar insistence that whatever is functional in post-colonial societies, like parliamentary democracy, this is a legacy of colonialism. But whatever afflicts the post-colonial society, whether it's poverty or inequalities, this is entirely the responsibility of their new political leaders. in this framework, nostalgia undermines any basis for historical responsibility or critical engagement. There are crucial consequences to how we remember the British Empire and the emergence of newly independent nations after 1945. It shapes how we assess the seeming failures of post-colonial nations to move on from their colonial past, how we make sense of Britain's efforts to reinvent its place in the world, and how we think about imperial activity today. The stakes for clearing up the moral fog that clings to imperialism are especially high in the formerly colonized world. For instance, if many scholarly historians today no longer take progress as their guiding assumption, the development goal, a legacy of liberal empire, so deeply embedded into the political and institutional structures and practices that it makes it difficult for post-colonial societies to shake off. Thus, post-colonial societies continue to be shaped by their colonial past in their struggle to move on or catch up along very Western frameworks of modernization. Another question that remains here is as to how we go about understanding the complexities of historical narratives that have so long been sustained by a framework that has very much focused on a singular perspective of the colonial officials. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So whilst there is much work to be done in this area, and no one single project could provide the solution, the aim of the Decolonized Digital Journal, as I mentioned earlier, was to provide final year students at King's with a very digital resource that allows them to recover the voices and experiences of Indigenous actors and communities, which are often overlooked and marginalized in the writing of histories, in this instance concerned with the era of decolonization. So on the map, you can see all the different regions that the journal covered. The Digital Journal was a collaborative effort between Professor of Imperial and Commonwealth History, Sarah Stockwell, who I think is on Zoom, within the department, and myself. It was funded through a education enhancement scheme run by King's, which provided a unique opportunity for postgraduate researchers like myself to lead the design of a course or very skill-specific engagement activity for undergraduate students in collaboration with a module convener. A crucial learning intervention of the project was to allow final year history students to realize their ambitions to do dissertation topics on decolonization in a wide variety of locations and from a wider variety of perspectives, whilst they were based in London, and therefore no longer being restricted to archives in the capital or in the southeast region. Our aim was to facilitate student access to more archival collections, notably overseas, by identifying for them as many digital collections and kind of showing them what was available on the internet. So the journal itself was initially devised for students on a final year dissertation module, which was called British Imperial Policy and Decolonization. So the journal overall, enables students to shift the focus away from the British and towards other perspectives, by enabling them access to a wider variety of primary sources, rather than those that were principally drawn from British archives. Therefore, it equipped students with primary sources that enabled them to engage in a more critical and richer way with themes such as race, gender, class, Indigenous activism, all within the colonies at this point of decolonization. This helped students to undertake research projects focused on the contribution, agency, and experience of Indigenous actors within the colonial setting and the post-colonial setting than they would have been done before. Next slide, please. But this initiative, is built on other initiatives that also are doing similar things. For instance, the British Library Endangered Archives Project, which has made an invaluable contribution in facilitating access in Britain and elsewhere to archival resources from the colonies and countries across the global south. So here within this map, you can sort of see a global span of where all of those archives are based. And if you Google British Library Endangered Archives, you can actually access all of these resources on their website. Next slide, please. So the digital journal had two principal learning aims. Firstly, it was to serve as a pedagogical purpose by providing students with a gateway to an extensive digital archive of primary sources. And secondly, it was to enhance digital literacy skills by familiarizing them with a variety of platforms and a means of navigating these digital archives, and to provide them with a digital set of skills that they would then be able to use in the workplace that is increasingly becoming more digital. I can't do a demonstration because the computer's up there, but if we go to the next slide, if you literally Google the Decolonized Digital Journal, you should be able to access the web page. And then if you just download the PDF on that website, you'll be able to access the journal and you'll be able to see all the different archives that are on there. But just to conclude, as we look forwards, the history of empires, not only the British, but other empires across time, continues to shape and influence the conditions of the modern world. It is not a historian's job to judge people and actions of the past, but to understand them and through them the range of the human experience. And whilst empire nostalgia of the British Empire continues to inform and embitter public discussions, as historians, we need to continue to challenge these very Eurocentric structures and frameworks of historical analysis to rectify the great imbalance in its historiography through the recovery of the perspective of the colonized, of the people who lived under empire, to enable us to truly grapple with the concept of empire and its legacies. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sandeep. It was very nice journal. I wish I'd been at King's at the moment I was here, but thank you. I know it's the end of the day. We're going to have time for a few questions only. Thank you for your patience. We got one from someone called Olukuju, which was for my colleague, Dr. Anna Harris. Let me read the question so that I'm not forgetting anything. So I heard no reference to Marika Sherwood, Hakim Adi, and Bassa. So basically, yes, that was a question.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for that really excellent question. Ultimately, that takes us deep into the module itself, and indeed to week 10 within the module. So the Black and Asian Studies Association that Marika Sherwood started in the 1990s with Hakim Adi is definitely within the course. Both scholarship is wended through it, particularly in discussion of Claudia Jones and Pan-Africanism. And the donation of the Bassa archive to the Black Cultural Archives has meant that students are exposed to the history of that organization and the work that it's done. And actually, we use that very source space to actually think about each generation's need to remind the Academy of the work to be done and the diversification of the curriculum to be undertaken. So in some ways, that particular question has taken us quite to the heart of thinking about the beginnings of the debate with Black Cultural Archives in the 1980s, and indeed the continuation of that debate through the 90s, and the re-efforts of those in the present to continue to to actually sort of reshape the kind of presentation of the national past told and the sources used for it. And just finally linking to Sandeep's paper, I helped the BCA to put a bid together using the VASA archives as part of the Endangered Archives funding project. So indeed, those archives are very much sort of in to the forefront of the work that the BCA is seeking to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is to Angel. I want to know how much the migrated archive scandal in London influenced the narratives about sources, about erasure in empire history, given the importance of that particular episode.
It's going to be a quick answer because I'm going to have to write that down and take you up on it. Again, my perspective is the American historian. So it's a kind of, it's the familiarity with what's going on with American scholarship and discussions there. But I want to learn more about this, and I will definitely fold it in. Yeah.
I've actually used Private Archives in my own research on what the British did in what was then British Cameroons, in northern Cameroons, and in southern Cameroons, to see how the British tried to make what is the region of Dikwa today in Borno State join Borno State and provide intelligence to the French army so that the French army could kill more people in Cameroon, to be blunt, basically. That's a summary of what I found out. I'll be happy to give you more about this. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, sorry, Prof.
Yeah, a little question to the last speaker about these endangered archives. I don't know how functional is that project. I mean, what they do to archives around the world. How can one access that? And then
I can send the details to Vincent to send to you, but it is freely available to anyone online. So it's an initiative the British Library has been doing for quite a few years. And there are archive material from all over the place, as you can see from the map. But I'll send the details to Vincent, he can forward it to you.
For example, we have a lot of manuscripts around, and we're thinking of organizing to collect these manuscripts and then put them in an order that researchers can come. For example, we have Islamic scholars that have written a lot, and some of them have died, and the manuscripts are in the various houses, not kept well, and sometimes they are just based on inheritance. People are keeping them and then don't use them in any way. So in what way can that endangered something help so much so that we can bring those manuscripts together in one particular library whereby scholars from everywhere can have access to them and make use of them?
I'm not sure. I've not actually properly used the archive, but I do know that they'd have funded various, so each of the pinpoints on the map is a project the British Library has funded to kind of help people in these different areas kind of digitalize. Basically like what's going on in the room not so far from here, where you're digitalizing archives. So it was simply like that sort of process. And then they put them all online and freely to access, which I think is a great resource.
I think just very quickly, I think this is also a scheme where they're very interested in actually expanding the archive further. So if you do know of an archive, particularly I think they define it as pre-industrial, that would be in need of preservation, you can apply. And then what the British Library does is I think they foot most of the cost. You keep the archive in place and they digitize it. On the other hand, there are arguments against, the danger this creates, that people stop going to that archive at all, which, means that knowledge becomes disembodied and displaced from where it actually took shape. But it is a very big scheme. And if you're interested in knowing more, we can definitely let you know more about it.
Let me add a quick word to that. You see, if the archives are already together, it's easier to apply for you to digitize them. Now, he's talking about documents that are still in possession of various families. Those are their family possessions. There are ethical issues, there are legal issues. You can't just take from them and digitize. No, they have to voluntarily hand them over first. The paperwork would have to be done. The archive should have been in existence. And it is when you can make a case that they are really endangered that you can now apply for such assistance. Those are documents that people are still keeping. It is their document. It hasn't come into the public space yet.
Thank you, Prof. If you're interested in British Library and Digital Archives, I worked 3 times with them. I've got 3 dots on them up. And they digitized documents before 1950. And if you're interested in documents after 1950, you can apply to the Modern and Digital Archives program from UCLA. And I can give you more information about that as well, if you want. Any other questions? Last one from Laye. The last comment? Okay.
All right, thank you. It's a question for Berenice. Your approach to teaching history, I understand that idea of empathizing with those students so that they are placed at a level where they become the voices in their researches in history. Now, let's take this back now to say the idea of decolonization, decolonize the curriculum, for instance. Because you have those who make some argument for what I call eliminative decolonization, that Africa has not been the center of knowledge production, and there is this argument for a replacement or a reversion of the order of our history is taught. And I'm going to pick two African philosophy scholars. One is Mbesimbe, is in University of Calabar, and the other is Bernard Matulino in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. So the point being raised by Matulino, for instance, is that, and I think this is a bit more radical anyways, that it made no sense teaching Plato's Republic in apartheid South Africa. That at that point, scholars should have been more interested, in looking at the contemporary political struggles within the country, and that should have informed the curriculum and teaching within South Africa. And even now that apartheid has ended, the focus on Afrocentrism, not Afrocentric, because there are 2 different concepts. Afrocentrism itself now is now been extended towards that radical condition of eliminative decolonization. So putting that side by side, your own approach to teaching, and I think also looking at it from the lens of, say, critical race theory, because you also find that very useful when teaching history. That, well, understand you should understand that the historical disadvantage of certain persons. And then when they become a member of the class, you should see the teaching of history from their lenses, right? But when it then moves towards that eliminative dimension, where argument is then made for an inversion, do you think that history itself remains as such? Or do you think that that idea of scholar activism could tamper with a whole lot within the teaching of history? This question may not be for you, but I think Professor Allow may also want to respond to that. Thank you.
A quick answer, Berenice, and we can finish, maybe wrap up. We're going to wrap up soon.
Very quick. I mean, I think that there is a lot to unpack in what you said, but maybe on the last point around history and activism, I think that they're very different ways of doing it. For me, one of the ways in which I think of activism in the classroom is precisely to show that actually, in a context where we talk, well, academic history is not relevant beyond the classroom, and the way historians work is you don't work the way, people are interested in reading history books by journalists or, I think to say actually, no, you can do the most rigorous and decentered and self-critical types of history and still actually find a way of connecting this to beyond the classroom and making it matter. So in other words, it's not that there's a false binary between the standards of historical rigor and historical methodology and making it relevant to the wider world. In the same way that I don't think we sell out, to be very colloquial, by thinking about, what do our students take from the historical skills we give them for their career. I think there is a way to do that. And for me, that is a form of activism that is really, really important. And that I hope my students, seemingly at least, react to well.
Thank you. Well, I guess maybe time for us to go, maybe to wrap up. But let me first, Dr. Jimo Mfoto Oluwasegun. You wanted to reply quickly? A quick one, Professor Lau?
I will just quickly say that what you teach and how you teach is a reflection of who you are. And that defines a lot in the approach to your scholarship and to your development of your curriculum. The person you are, your ideological position, your intellectual depth, and your approach to life will necessarily determine what you teach and how you teach and the results you intend to achieve at the end of the day. And my last question will be for Alanon. You gave us a brief of your paper, and I was just curious. And I said, let me ask you this question. I was going to pass it, but I said, okay, let me seize this opportunity to ask it. Is there a way you can rehabilitate the history of the successful Black woman in British history? The successful Black woman. Your narrative talked about the oppressed, the marginalized, and all whatnot. What about the successful Black woman? Is there any lesson from history for the successful Black woman?
Thank you, Prof.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry if I gave the impression that this was, there's a multiplicity of voices within this module. And indeed, for example, drawing on the oral history project of thinking about the Black feminist movement from the 70s and 80s, these are women that have gone on to be involved in politics, to be involved in classrooms, to be involved in the production of wonderful scholarship, and entrepreneurial activities too, in terms of sort of small businesses and the like. So absolutely, this is that archive in particular, thinking about the Heart of the Race project in the 1970s and the oral history project with many of those that were part of that 1970s project in 2019 shows actually over 40 years the ways many of those have drawn from their early days and their activist days in universities and student organizations to actually go on to become crucial community leaders sort of within Black movements in Britain. So there's a full panoply of a multiplicity of voices, including success stories to celebrate.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. So let me conclude then again, second time. So actually, let me first, I'd like to thank our online speakers today. Professor Falola, who was awake at night for us, so thank you. I also wish, one of our colleagues was with us today, Professor Sarah Stockwell, who's working on these questions as well, quite a lot, maybe you have the chance to meet her one of these days. I'd also to thank our guests, who are here with us today. Thank you for staying, up until, how was it, 5:40, something like that, 5:40. It means a big appetite for all these questions. With Dr. Jimo Mfoto Oluwasegun, with whom I co-organized this conference, we thought that maybe we can have a follow-up one day. Professor Falola's idea of asking students' opinion exactly and having their feedback of what we're going to do would be very interesting. So maybe that's the next step. So thank you, Doctor. I'd like to thank, of course, the Institute of African Studies. You know, we are in the Drepos Hall here. We're staying in that building right now. I also like to say thank you to Erudite live stream services. Thank you for all your good work today. We also have Toby Akinde, who took photos, filmed us all day long. He was very sweaty this morning and he made it. Thank you, Toby. And thank you, Bimbo Moposi, also at the back who's with Zoom all day and has been running around as well. So thank you to both of you. So thank you for coming, and I hope we will carry on this conversation later on. Thank you.